Microphones off, everybody. Mobiles off. Thank you very much for coming in today, Mr. Diamond. This hearing is subject to parliamentary privilege, and we will hope and expect that you'll, as a result, be able to speak freely, and of course, even more freely now you've resigned. The hearing's about turmoil at one of Britain's leading financial institutions, and certainly I accept that Barclays has suffered bad publicity, partly because you settled first. Nonetheless, these issues go much wider than that LIBOR settlement, even though that did appear to have precipitated your resignation. I think before we go any further, given that you have resigned, I would like to give you an opportunity to explain your reasons.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Wow. I love Barclays. That's where it starts. I love Barclays because of the people. It's 16 years ago today, on July 4th, 1996, that I began at Barclays. And it's been 16 years of just tremendous enjoyment. And that enjoyment has been driven by the incredible, it's 140,000 people in over 50 countries around the world. But, Chairman, as you said, this week the focus has been on Barclays, and as you said, in many ways because they were first. And I worry that the world looks at Barclays in a small group of traders, or a group of traders, who had reprehensible behavior, and that is being put on Barclays in a way that is not representative of the firm that I love so much, and the way they treat their customers and clients, and the way they deal with problems. And I think that comes to the core of the issue is clearly there were mistakes, clearly there was behavior that was reprehensible, but as soon as this was recognized, Barclays put all forces. If there's a mistake, if there's a problem, how do we handle it? What do we do about it? And in Barclays, it has been 3 years with 3 of the most important regulatory agencies in the world, looking at millions of files, all 3 regulatory agencies applauding Barclays for their cooperation, their analysis, their proactivity. We hired 2 external firms to work with 2 members of senior management, reporting to the chairman of the board and the chairman of the audit committee. And the attitude of Barclays 3 years ago when this was recognized was, let's get to the bottom of it. Let's identify the problem, take the actions necessary, learn our lessons, and if any of our customers and clients got hurt, let's make them good. And I think that attitude is recognized by the three regulatory agencies in what they wrote, but it does not coming out in the court of public opinion over the last week. And fundamentally, my decision to resign is my leadership, and questions about my leadership have been a part of that. And the best way I think I can help bridge Barclays from the turmoil of being the only one out and bridge them so that this is looked at in the true context of being about an industry and about LIBOR in addition to Barclays, and prevent the damage to the reputation that's happened over the last week. The best way for me to do that was to step down, but continue to come here and answer the questions of the committee. I love Barclays. History will judge Barclays as an incredible institution because of its people. We need to get through this period, and the best way for me to do that was to step down.
Why did you change your mind over the weekend? What was it? What was the trigger? There have been reports that there was pressure from the regulators. Is that correct?
Well, let me explain why I changed my mind. It's a good question, and it wasn't over the weekend because we worked over the weekend on a communication to our colleagues internally, and we did that knowing that we had the support of the board, the support of our shareholders who we had been working with from the announcement toward the end of the week, of our colleagues, of our clients and our customers and our regulators. And it was clear to me on Monday that support wasn't as strong and that I needed to take this step in this bridge. The support from the regulators wasn't as strong as it had been, and I needed to take this step.
Okay, I just want to pin that down. Did one or more of the senior regulators ring Marcus Aegis?
I don't know.
And when Marcus Aegis spoke to you, or you spoke to him, did he refer at all to any pressure of any type that had come?
I think that's probably a question for Marcus, and who I know is here next week.
Well, I'm asking you to tell me what he would have told you in that conversation. You will have had a conversation with your chairman about this and about the sustainability of your continued role as chief executive.
I would say, broadly speaking, it was just as I said, that the focus of intensity on my leadership, it was better for me to step down and
why are you so reluctant to tell us what may have transpired with those regulators over the weekend? We're going to have them before us.
I didn't. I'm trying to think if I had any conversations with regulators over the weekend.
You didn't. But Marcus Aegis did, didn't he?
Chairman, I think it's just as simple as if Marcus had conversations with regulators, that's a conversation for him to have with you. I did not discuss that with him. I just discussed my reasons.
It's widely held that regulators have lost confidence, and it's not just LIBOR in your leadership at Barclays. Why do you think that is?
I think there has been an unfortunate series of events in the last week around Barclays being identified as the first bank in what was, a report that clearly showed very, very bad behavior by groups of people. And how we dealt with that, Chairman, I think was appropriate, and I think it was a sign of the culture at Barclays, but that's not coming out.
The answer you're giving me is that it's the first mover disadvantage point.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. But it's true, isn't it? At least I've been told that the FSA were concerned about your appointment as chief executive, and that they sought assurances from the board at the time you were appointed that there would be a change of culture in Barclays. Is that not correct?
That's the first I've ever heard that there was any question about my appointment as chief executive. I certainly went through, as a chief executive appointment would, interviews with the Financial Services Authority, and I got very strong support for my appointment to chief executive.
And you know nothing of any written submission by the FSA to the board at that time setting out the need for an improvement in the corporate governance of Barclays, and an improvement in the culture, and the need to look better at how you were assessing the risk appetite, and to improve the control framework. You know nothing about this.
I know nothing about at the time that I was appointed it. Correct. I don't know anything.
We're talking about September 2010 here.
Correct.
Yeah. And you know nothing about at all about the suggestion that you were asked to provide assurances that you'd challenge your long-term colleagues at Barcap not to take excessive risk.
I don't remember any specific comments, but I'm sure there were discussions with the regulators during the process of my succession where my memory is more around would I be able to, having been associated with the investment bank for a number of years, would I be able to disassociate myself? So as a group chief executive, I'd be able to leave the running of the investment bank to, at the time, Rich and Jerry.
Is it true that in February this year the FSA came to the board and expressed their concerns?
I think it's every year, Chairman, that in that February meeting that the FSA comes. So
what was said?
The context of the discussion when it got to controls, which I think is what you're asking about, or I should call it the control environment, as that the focus and the tone at the top was something that they were specifically happy with. In particular, they talked to the board about Chris and I and our relations with the regulators, how we dealt with any situation that came up. I'm thinking of...
Isn't it a bit more specific than that, Mr. Diamond? Didn't they tell you that trust had broken down between the FSA and Barclays?
I don't recall that in the February meeting.
Didn't they tell you that they no longer have confidence in your senior executive management team?
No, sir.
And wasn't all this followed up with a letter?
There was a discussion that as it got down into the organization, they felt that there was some culture issues, that people sometimes push back, that some of the pushback wasn't always filtered up to the top. So there was an overall discussion on culture. We took some of this as this is the annual review from the FSA. And
this is the sort of thing they say every year?
Well, no, I didn't mean it that way at all, sir. Apologies. But it was part of an annual review, so it's always going to have some things that they're going to be critical of and that we can do better. But they were specifically pleased and said so to the board with the tone at the top, referring in particular to Chris Lucas and myself and our colleagues on the executive committee.
Isn't it true that there were challenges from them about your stress tests, your accounting practices, the handling of the Protean deal, and of course we've subsequently had the debt buyback scheme, the interest rate swaps problems, and of course now LIBOR? Isn't this all part of a pattern?
Yeah, I don't remember anything. I didn't brief before this in the February meeting, so I don't mean to skip over anything if I am. There was a conversation, I think, about there had been a series of things such as Proteum, which became quite an issue between the FSA and ourselves. And without going into, the versions of that transaction, because it was a transaction that was approved by the FSA. But I think, to be fair, it was a transaction that created, and I wasn't the chief executive at the time, so I'm probably speculating a little bit. But it was a transaction that created more debate between the FSA and Barclays than probably anyone anticipated when the transaction was done. Wow. And I remember Proteum coming up during that meeting in the context of let's not have these types of situations.
Well, this will all come out in the wash, what happened in September 2010 and indeed what happened in February this year. Can I turn to the decision during the crisis to lower the LIBOR returns? In your letter to me last week, you said that, and I quote, the decision to lower LIBOR submissions was wrong. When was that decision, or referring to a decision, when was that decision taken?
Context, and I discussed with you that there will be times to put context. I think our letter to you laid out pretty well that there's three different periods that it's easiest for me to refer to. There was the period between 2005 and 2007 with some activity that carried up into 8 and very early in 09, but primarily 05 to 07, which was about a group of traders and the influence they were putting on the rate setters. That's one period. There was a second period, which I think you're referring to, which was during the credit crisis of 2007 to 2008, when there was pressure put on the rate setters coming from the Barclays group. If I could just finish with the third, and then I can call them 1, 2, and 3 going forward. The third was really the period toward the end of 2008, October 2008, where there were questions about the Bank of England discussion with a senior person and pressure on rates. So those are the three periods, and I think you're dealing with the middle one.
Okay, so this decision was taken in, from what we can tell from the FSA documentation, in September 2007?
The decision to influence rates?
Yes, to lower LIBOR submissions.
I'm pretty sure that was the, I can't remember if it was exactly September.
I am surprised that you're unsure. I mean, it's pretty reasonably clear from,
I thought you were asking the
FSA
first instance. I think it was September, yes.
I mean, this is all set out in paragraphs 111 to 114 of the FSA's final notice report. I just wanted to clarify that the decision that you're referring to in your letter is indeed the decision and the set of actions taken in paragraphs 111 to 114.
I apologize, Chairman, I'm confused. I think there was a different set of decisions from traders, and some of those happened before September 2007.
No, I'm talking about this second period.
Yes,
we're talking about correct. The period in the crisis to lower LIBOR, specifically to lower it. I began by saying I was talking about that latter period, not the first period. This does make clear, doesn't it, that the decision to lower LIBOR was not taken as a result of the Tucker conversation, which didn't take place till over a year later.
Excuse me, that's correct.
Okay. Let's just turn to the Tucker file note. Do you usually take a file note?
Occasionally, I would say, not frequently.
How many have you taken of your contacts with regulators over this relevant period? You've listed the relevant contacts with regulators in your submission to us.
Yeah, most of those contacts were not me. And it is today.
How many of them were you?
I think on that schedule, the only one that referred to me was the conversation with Paul.
You had no other contact with regulators apart from that one?
Sorry, I think what we were listing there was the specific.
I'm at page 7 of the supplementary evidence that you produced for us yesterday.
This is the submission that Barclays sent in yesterday.
And I'd like to know how many of these contacts are you?
I had fairly frequent contact with the regulator during this period, but my contact would generally be with the Bank of England or with people below the Hector level, because at this time John was the chief executive.
Now, of this fairly frequent contact, how many of those were file noted? Roughly?
Maybe a few.
A handful? Less than a handful? A handful. So the fact that you took a file note is very significant indeed, isn't it?
Well, today I do it regularly because as chief executive I have regular, more official meetings. But in terms of a phone call, that would be correct.
What did you take to mean by the phrase that Mr. Tucker used, the phrase Whitehall, in that? You wrote it down and put it in your file note. Yes,
and I did. And I think that was the core of the reason that I dictated that note and communicated with John right away. And as you saw, the file note was to John. And the concern we had, if I can put it in context, is this was October 29th, 2008. I don't have to remind the committee what October of 2008 was like. We had the government intervention in Royal Bank of Scotland. Yeah. We had the government intervention in Lloyd's.
Okay, I am actually asking you a question
Sorry,
about
I
what
should
you
have
took to
been more
mean-
direct. I apologize.
What you took to mean by the phrase Whitehall
On
when you wrote that down.
On October 31st, 2 days later, the fundraising from the Middle East was completed. So within the context of this market, there was a worry that if people in Whitehall, which in my mind are officials in the government.
Right, that's all I was asking.
Sorry.
We've now arrived at the answer. You think it was officials. Okay. The note from Mr. Tucker says that he felt your LIBOR returns could be lower, doesn't it?
He felt that our LIBOR rates relative to the other 15 posters.
Could be relatively lower.
Yeah.
Yeah? Why then on page 2 of your note to this committee yesterday did you say you don't believe you received an instruction?
I didn't believe it was an instruction.
So what was it, a nod and a wink?
The most important thing of that note to me, Chairman, was the comment that there was a perception in Whitehall that our rates were high, and the worry that I shared with John that if members of the government thought were told our rates were high relative to others, and if they then took that to mean that we couldn't fund or were having trouble funding, and I have to be very patient here, when in fact we were funding adequately in one of the worst market environment, well, the worst market environment that I had ever been a part of in 30 years in banking. And it was clear that a number of the firms who were posting had emergency loans or had been nationalized or were having trouble funding, and yet we were posting the highest level. Then, as I said to Paul, we are funding at those levels, but we would question whether some of the other institutions can actually get funds at the levels they're posting. If I can just finish for a second.
My question's about what you took
the implication of that for Whitehall.
To mean. I mean, if I read it out to you, your LIBOR returns do not always need to be as high as we have recently.
And I think what Paul was
pretty
warning
clear,
me
which in
about,
other words, your LIBOR returns could be lower.
Well, if you look at one more page in here, just so I can make your point even more, because I think it's the right point. So if you look at page 22, which are the LIBOR submissions of 16 banks that submit 3-month dollar LIBOR, which was the question at the time. And if you look at the top of that page and that line that goes across, that's the Barclays submission. And here is the important point. In October 2008, when Barclays was funding adequately, probably as well as any international bank and as well, or probably close to as well as any bank that submitted. And there were banks here that were posting levels lower than this, even those that were nationalized. And 100% of the days in October 2008, 100% of the days, we were the highest post in LIBOR or the next to highest. It's really important, Chairman, if you can bear with me. To hear some of the comments that have been made that Barclays was lowering their submissions for their reputation or things like that. Barclays during that month was reporting levels at which they were borrowing. And yet 15 firms, 100% of the days, 14 or 15 firms, 100% of the days were reporting at levels lower than that. And some of those banks couldn't fund at any level. We were worried that the impression.
We know that others are up to this.
No, that wasn't the point.
Mr. Diamond,
I'm
okay,
almost done.
if we could get to the point.
If Whitehall then was told Barclays is at the highest of LIBOR, without knowing all that I just went through, they might say to themselves, my goodness, they can't fund. We need to nationalize them, as they had nationalized other British banks. This was a very important period. We weren't desperate. We had £6.7 billion in equity being raised. Or if rumors got on the market that we couldn't fund, maybe we couldn't complete the equity raising. So the single most important financing that Barclays has had, I think, in...
Okay, I just want to be clear.
Sorry.
You don't think you received an instruction. You don't think it was even a nod and a wink, even though it reads that way to almost anyone who looks at it. But you were monitoring LIBOR daily, weren't you, Mr. Diamond? You were monitoring LIBOR daily and your returns by then.
Was I monitoring
LIBOR? You were
LIBOR
monitoring LIBOR, keeping a very close eye on it. It was a key indicator of the health of your bank.
I was aware of it. I wouldn't say I was the key person monitoring it, no.
No, you weren't the key person, but you were being told what it was.
I was on a daily report, yes.
Yes, you were getting a daily report.
Yep.
And you would have noticed that it fell the day after you sent that email.
That's a very good question. I don't want to get you upset, but this is going to take a second. This is really important because there was a report in the press today about how on the day of that note, the next day or 2 days later, LIBOR rates went down. If you look at the very next page of November, you will see that through all of November as well, Barclays was either the 14th, 15th, or 16th. We were either the highest, second highest, or third highest. But this is a relative rating. Where did we post versus the other 15 banks? What you're referring to is following our fundraising, which was a very positive news to the market, levels of LIBOR went down across the market. It had nothing to do with Barclays submissions. Barclays submissions were still at the high end, meaning that we were still reporting at those levels, or as, you know.
Well, I got the point.
I think this is really
I think
important,
we already knew that point.
So it's the difference between the relative rating. When someone says your LIBORs are,
we're all talking
someone
about
says your LIBORs are
rates.
high, they mean that relative to the other posting banks, as opposed to LIBOR is high, which means the absolute level of rates. And we had two different events here. We had Barclays at the high level relative to the other firms, and then we had a reduction in LIBOR based on good news in the market, which was part of that was the fundraising of Barclays.
Jesse Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Diamond, you talked about setting up Barcap in 1998, and I think I'm right in saying you'd come to it having been global head of fixed income at Credit Suisse, West Boston, and before that at Morgan Stanley. So how long had you been in the debt markets before you arrived at Barclays?
I think my first position at Morgan Stanley in the money markets, which I think you would consider the same, was 1981 or 82.
Right. So that's, what it is, 27 years. No, sorry, 17 years.
17.
Excuse me.
You're aging me.
I'll get there, Richard. And
you were
so
at Barclays
in
at the time, too.
that I left sadly before you'd set up Barclays.
We shared some time at VZW, though.
Tell me about your experience of the bond markets. You'd been in the derivatives markets?
No derivative person would ever consider me a derivative person, I can assure you. I'm a little old for that. So I was really money markets, and when I was actively involved before I was in management, I was in the cash markets or the money markets.
Right. And also markets that came out of, that were funded off those, like bond markets?
I'm sorry?
Like bond markets funded off the cash markets or indirectly? Yeah. Okay. Fixed and floating rates, LIBOR?
Mostly U.S. Treasuries or European governments or Japanese governments. So it was more the governments and supranational subjects.
Right. So in other words, when you arrived at the opportunity to set up Barcap, you had been living and breathing the debt capital markets in different forms for 17 years.
It was more the government markets,
and
fixed income, yes.
And the opportunity for you was to use the Barclays balance sheet and the treasury function to then set up a bank in that used your ideas and your experience as you wanted it to be.
Well, I would have said it slightly differently, but there was an opportunity at Barclays because Barclays at that time had as you know, Jesse, it was more of a UK focused as opposed to international, but all products, so equity, yes. M&A. Yeah.
And well, I think I remember you saying that, to the committee that it was subscale, BCW was subscale, employed slightly less than high quality people and didn't pay them very much. So the opportunity to change all those things must have been exciting and interesting.
And part of the subscale is they had scale in the UK, but other firms it was impacting their ability to expand internationally, which they were trying to do.
Right. When you set up Barcap, you were responsible directly, therefore, for recruiting senior staff, deciding which products you as it were focused on, markets that you played in around the world. Those all have fallen under the experience that.
Well, certainly we would have gone to the board if we entered any new products or any new regions, but
right.
I would have been part of driving that strategy and presenting it.
Did you run it on a very hands-off basis, as it were, decentralized, or did you give people a free rein, let them do what they like, or how did you run it?
I think my management style, if that's what you're asking at the time, was to have a executive committee that had all the representatives of the things that reported up into me. I certainly preferred a consensus style of management, that we could agree on the right decision as opposed to the chief executive making all of those decisions. If that's what you're asking. Sorry, you asked about centralized. I think people would have considered it more centralized rather than less centralized.
Yeah. I just really want, that makes sense. I just wanted to establish that you had a high level of familiarity with the bank because you were starting with a relatively blank sheet of paper from Barclays, recruiting these teams, setting up products, setting up markets according to a financial and an economic model that you believed in.
In some ways, it's interesting. In the gilt market, for example, even today, some of our people have been here 25, 30, 35 years in the money markets because Barclays had such a rich and strong tradition in the sterling-based market that many of those people have been with the bank for quite a while. And then conversely, as we began operating in areas where we didn't have a very much of an operation, it would typically be people hired from the outside.
So there'd have been lots of people all the way down the bank dealing with the Bank of England then because of the experience and provenance of the bank. Senior management, but also treasury people within different parts of the bank. What are the other kinds of parts of the bank would have been dealing with the Bank of England?
Well, certainly it would have started with a group treasury. My recollection, you may remember, was Patrick Perry was the group treasurer there, reporting into Oliver Stockin. And so all of the group funding issues, which sometimes were executed, I think in the Visa W days as well, the execution was done through the markets group, but the governance and the decisions were made by group treasury. Ewan Harkness, who I know you would remember and has been with the firm until recently, had probably the closest relationship with the Bank of England in our gilt-edged operation.
I don't know him at all, but I didn't even met him or heard of him. But tell me about your relationship then with the Bank of England. Do you think the bank was slow to respond to the crisis in 2007-8? Is that what's lying behind some of these concerns?
No, I don't. I think our bank, if we look relative to other banks in the world, I think one of the best decisions we made as an institution in Barclays. If I look over the period of the financial crisis and say to myself, Bob, what is the single best decision that Barclays got right? I think it was when it was clear in October 2008, the period we're talking about, that the FSA had made a decision to ask all banks to carry more equity. And soon after had nationalized, I may be overusing the word because it might have been an equity stake, but Lloyd's, HBOS merger with Lloyd's had been arranged. I think we know today that a £62 billion loan had been arranged for HBOS. I think it was after the announcement of the deal, but before the completion of the deal with Lloyd's. But with all those things going on in the market, we raised capital privately.
So I think we're talking across purposes. I'm talking about the Bank of England.
Sorry, I apologize.
That's fine. So, in other words, was the Bank of England slow to respond to the crisis in 2007 and 8?
There's many different levels of response, and I think being a market practitioner, we always wanted as much response as we could get from the big central banks in terms of money market conditions. I don't recall a specific example, but I
living and breathing the debt markets, you would have seen the bank's operation, the Bank of England's operations, either existing or not existing, supporting or not supporting the bank. So your view then is
I think the Fed took the lead.
Yes.
I would say it that way, and so I think I understand where you're going. Is were people in the markets, or was I critical. I wouldn't have called it critical, but we were working with and encouraging more activity from the Bank of England in terms of the money markets.
The point I want to get to is whether or not the Bank of England's slowness to respond put further strain or unnecessary strain on the Barclays balance sheet as it did with other banks. And if so, whether that might have actually made the crash worse and created some of the adverse behavior we've seen.
When we look back at that period, Jesse, I think it would be fair for me to say that Barclays, for a host of reasons, tradition, the quality of the brand name, the fact that we had a balance of funding coming from around the world, so we had central bank deposits from, Central Bank of Japan, from China, that we had access to funding that was different than many banks, a credit rating that was strong, a balance sheet that was
that
strong.
isn't answering my question at all.
I think
whether the Bank of England has been adequately supporting.
I don't think that was an issue for us. I think the day-to-day funding of the bank, I think that's what you're asking for, our access to money markets, our access to funds. I would have categorized it relative to the other banks, not just headquartered in the UK, but the other global banks, was right at the very top in terms of our access to liquidity and our access to funding.
So you didn't have to make any asset sales. You were happy with the Bank of England. You were.
We had to make sales of securities that we felt were, but it was more based not on could we get them funded. It was based on the fact that they're going to deteriorate in value.
And you're watching the markets.
So we felt comfortable. I don't want to overstate it because the markets were in turmoil, but relative to the other banks and relative to our need to fund, I think the Bank of England and the Fed would also say Barclays was in a very good position in funding.
So your point is you're watching the Barclays balance sheet like a hawk. You need to fund, you're making sure that these rates are properly doing their job. If the screen's on the table, seeing how whether what's the right moment to come into the market, that kind of thing.
I was not day-to-day on the desk at all, or timing when we came into the market at all, no.
But you would be following, looking at.
Let me say it another way, I would have had a report if we had a funding problem.
Sure, thank you.
Michael Fallon.
Thank you, Chairman. And can I remind the committee of my registered interest as a non-executive director of Tulloch Prebon, which is one of the brokers that was asked by the FSA to help with the investigation, to provide information to help with the investigation into the banks. Can we, Mr. Diamond, go back to the file note of your call? You said in answer to the chairman that you thought the senior figures referred to were, you said at one point, officials in the government, and then later on you said members of the government. Which do you believe? Who do you think they were?
I would only be speculating if I told you who I thought they were, and I don't think it's appropriate to speculate. My recollection is Paul didn't mention who he was referring to, or I would have put it in the note.
Right, but who do you think he could possibly have been referring to?
I don't want to speculate.
A department or?
Senior people in the government.
Right. Are you aware that Shruti Vadera today told the BBC, and I quote, "Of course LIBOR was a concern"?
Someone told me this morning that there was something in the paper about Shruti and LIBOR, and I have not had a chance to look at it, so that would be, it's relatively new to me, but I heard a reference this morning.
Prior to this phone call with Paul Tucker, did you have any other discussions with ministers or officials or the Bank of England about the LIBOR?
The Shruti was very involved in the recapitalization of the banks in the UK, but keep in mind, in October of 2008, I had just moved to New York, following the decision that the board made to acquire the U.S. business of Lehman Brothers, having been in London with Barclays. Since having joined, I moved back to New York in that September. So John, and secondly, John was the CEO. So we would tend to, John and I worked very well in terms of who had primary responsibility and secondary responsibility. And he was doing most of the communication with Shriti, but I would say that oftentimes Shriti would ask to see me as well. I think it was more often John. I think Paul Miners and Shriti would have been people that John had on his list, not Marcus. And
Right.
I would see them far less than John, but I would see them from time to time. And the time to time was a bit less, having been relocated to New York.
Yeah, okay. But I just want to be clear. So there were discussions with Shruti Vadera
Yeah.
in the period immediately prior to the 29th of October.
I'm not sure if there were discussions immediately prior. I would think there might have been, but I'm not saying there weren't. I just don't have any recollection.
You don't remember meeting her? You think it would have been John Varley who met her?
And it could have, Michael, I'm not trying to be evasive. It may have
No,
been.
you said you thought she was involved.
Yes.
You told us she
we
was
weren't
involved.
being recapitalized.
Right.
We were doing it privately. And, sorry, I can give a better answer. I do think at that time it was primarily being driven by John, yes. And so I was hearing from John about his meetings with Shriti, but I also want to be just clear that from time to time I would see her as well. And I think it tended to be after this time more than before this time.
Were you shocked when you wrote this file note down that, in effect, senior figures in the government, officials or ministers, might have been asking you to fiddle the LIBOR?
I think what's interesting is my reaction to that note was appreciation of Paul Tucker in doing his job. What he was trying to tell me is, Bob, there are ministers in Whitehall who are hearing that Barclays is always high. That could lead to the impression that you are not funding yourself, and that's why it took so long to walk through it earlier. My first reaction was, John, you have to get to Whitehall. You have to make sure they know that we are funding fine. It's not wonderfully, it's adequately, but we have an equity issue about to settle in 2 days. We're raising 6.7 billion pounds of capital when a number of British banks had just taken capital from the government. This was a very, very pressurized situation, Michael. So I wouldn't have used the word shocked, but this is probably a momentous week in the history of Barclays, in the history of the financial markets.
I understand all that, but the effect of what you've written down here is that ministers or officials were in effect asking you to fiddle your submission.
I didn't believe that, no.
What did you think they were trying to do then?
Well,
I mean, that's what it says here, isn't it?
I have had conversations with
It did
Paul
not need to
before.
be the case that we appeared as high as we have recently.
Well, it's not the first conversation I had had with Paul about relative levels of LIBOR. And I wouldn't say it was exactly those words, but Barclays had consistently been at the high end during the financial crisis. And I was worried that if I can be perfectly frank, you will see in that note to the file what I said back to John. I'm probably paraphrasing, sorry, to Paul. I'm paraphrasing, but I said, did you explain to the ministers the real story, which is that other banks are posting rates below ours and yet are not borrowing money at those levels? It's not that our rates are wrong, but we are worried, and I can't say this because I didn't know this to be true, but I was worried at looking at that other banks, and this is why, Michael, I've gone to such pains to say this. We had banks with secret loans. We had banks that were being nationalized. We had banks in Germany that were struggling. By the way, I'm not talking about Deutsche Bank, but West LB, I think, was struggling at that time. So there were clearly a number of banks that posting levels significantly below ours didn't seem to us to be right. And so if this is going to lead to an impact on our ability to raise equity in the markets, this is at the very core of banking. This is at the very core of funding.
Okay. Are there notes
This
of
was
your...
a huge issue.
Sure, and you discussed it earlier, you've just told us, with Paul Tucker. Are there notes of those meetings?
Not that we've located. Or not, sorry, that sounded unusual. Not that we know of.
Not that you know of. Okay, could I turn now to the lack of an instruction to Jerry Del Maizière? You say in your supplementary submission here on page 2 that Jerry Del Maizière concluded that an instruction had been passed from the bank not to keep the LIBORs so high, and therefore passed down a direction to that effect to the submitters. Given you see Delmisier presumably every day, how did he misconstrue the purpose of this phone call? How did that happen?
Well, you read the note, and I think the chairman said he misconstrued it. I think Jerry has been very honest that there was a misunderstanding or miscommunication between the communication of the Bank of England down, and that he was the person that instructed. And I think while I was not aware of that, I do think it's important to put in the context what actually happened. And I would refer you back to those same pages in October and November. And if you look at the impact on our rate of LIBOR relative to the others, we never moved into the submission territory. So the top 4 rates are excluded from the submission.
Yeah, I understand.
So it was wrong. It was pressure put on the LIBOR setters, but it didn't change the published LIBOR rate. It changed our submission, but we were still one of the excluded rates.
I understand all of that. Well, what I want to know is, how did Jerry Delmisier get this wrong when you'd just been talking to him? How did he not believe it was an instruction, either from the bank or from the public authorities?
Michael, with apologies, I can't put myself in Jerry's shoes. What is said here, and the FSA is part of the three regulatory agencies that worked with Barclays for 3 years. In addition to this report, they also did an individual investigation of Jerry. And their conclusion was to clear him, that it was a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, and that Jerry was cleared by the FSA when they investigated. I may be using the wrong word, clear, but you know what I mean. They during this time, the FSA, separate from this investigation, investigated Jerry and said it's a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. It's not something that we, the FSA, are going to act on.
Yeah.
And so when I was made aware of this, I talked to the FSA to confirm that that was their conclusion.
Okay, can I turn finally to the Department of Justice Appendix A, paragraph 42, which refers to general concern amongst your employees that they were looking, I quote, attempted to find a solution that would allow Barclays to submit honest rates without standing out from other members of the panel. And they expressed the view that Barclays could achieve that goal if other banks submitted honest rates. Were you aware of that argument your submitters were having with the BBA and the FSA and the bank?
I'm certainly aware now, post the investigation, and I think in here, which I think it's appropriate to bring that up now, there is on page 7 kind of a chart of how many times people at Barclays discussed with the FSA, with the BBA, with the Fed, and with the Bank of England, that we were worried that although we were posting rates, there was a worry that others may not be posting rates at the level where transactions could occur. And I do think it's an important part of this overall discussion, particularly in the context of the industry-wide issue.
I understand that.
That these were issues that were brought up with the regulators consistently over a number of years.
Yeah, I understand.
And I think one of the reasons they hadn't been apparent in earlier years is it took the credit crisis to explode the difference between one bank's rates and another bank's rates, where for a very long time, rates were so tight and there was so much liquidity in the market that if someone was a little bit off, it didn't show as much, and it really exacerbated the impact.
But my question was whether you and the senior people were aware that your employees were having this argument. You weren't aware of that?
No.
Right. As it then goes on to say, these communications were not intended or understood as disclosures through which Barclays self-reported misconduct to the authorities. Should you not have been aware of that?
Let me get to the exact spot so that I know where it is. Which page is that, Michael?
Paragraph 42. It's page 18 of Appendix A.
Department of Justice, did you say?
The Department of Justice statement. Thanks. So that's my last question.
And I think you recall in one of those discussions, and I know this because of the investigation, but as I said, I was not aware of it at the time. There was a meeting to discuss this between the compliance head at Barclays and the FSA, and the report back was to carry on.
But you weren't aware of that?
No, I was not. But the discussion was, as you said, just to make it clear about being in the pack versus being at the top.
Yeah, thank you.
Bearing in mind how important that rate was to Barclays, as you just said earlier, what does it say about the management culture that you weren't aware of those discussions?
Well, Chairman, I think if I put in context the three things that we're dealing with, which is with the trader misconduct, as soon as that was identified, an investigation.
We're talking about the discussions at the time, which Michael's just been referring. Rather than going all the way back to square one and going through all these three separate episodes, why, when this got serious, were you unaware?
It was not brought to that level. And part of that was that there were ongoing meetings at a level below that with the regulators.
Why not? What was wrong with Barclays that something so important was not reported up?
Well, I think there was a feeling that it had been resolved. But was there a general understanding? I just want to make sure of which question you're asking. The question of there may be some firms that are not reporting levels.
I think you've answered the question.
Okay.
David Ruffley.
Mr. Diamond, on page 3 of the FSA notice, it says Barclays acted inappropriately and breached Principle 5 on numerous occasions. That's Principle 5 of the Principles of Business. Between September 2007 and May 2009, by making LIBOR submissions which took into account concerns over the negative media perception of Barclays LIBOR submissions. I'm going to use the shorthand for lowballing. Okay?
Yep.
Fine. Just so I don't have to repeat that. Now, in relation to that, the FSA go on to say on page 3, which I'm sure is burned in your memory, senior management's concerns about what other banks were doing, perhaps not telling the truth, as Mr. Fallon has referred to. Senior management's concerns resulted in instructions being given by less senior managers at Barclays to reduce LIBOR submissions in order to avoid negative media comment. Now, this was going on well before the 29th of October 2008 and your telephone call with Paul Tucker, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, it has to be, because that's what the FSA have reported. Now, can you tell me and tell us when you discovered that this lowballing activity was going on?
During the investigation.
So you didn't know that this was going on when you spoke to Mr. Tucker on the 29th of October 2008?
No, that would have been before the investigation. So I was not aware of it.
Okay. Now, when did you discover? You're saying in the course of the investigation, what month approximately?
Well, there are two things that happened, David, so I have to go back. There was a, soon after the credit crisis, so we're into 2009, there was requests that came in from the CFTC to investigate. I may be using the wrong word, investigate, but to do a study or investigate.
Investigate will do.
And it was during that when it was, where both the situation of the credit crisis, 07 to 08, was part of what I was learning going through the investigation.
Forgive me, I don't wish to be rude in interrupting, but give me an approximate date when you discovered this lowballing, which is the subject of the FSA notice. That's why you've been fined. That's ultimately one of the reasons you've lost your job, Mr. Diamond. When did you discover this lowballing was going on? Simple question, approximately.
The findings of the investigation, other than things I learned as a witness, please, this is important, sure. David, you should be able to answer, came to me 4 or 5 days before they were published. I wasn't alone in this, but other members of management, because of the conversations that we've been having as witnesses, were not over the Chinese wall. So my job was to make sure that we had the investigation going on as it was reporting to the board. But I think, as I explained to the chairman at one of my
with respect, for the third time, what month did you discover the lowballing was going on? Just give me a date.
This month.
This month, as late as this month. Because it raises the question, you as chief executive, why on earth didn't you know that this was going on your watch? You said to an earlier question that you had daily reports on libel.
Well, I think what this refers to, again, if I can...
Well, we know what it refers to. We're talking about the lowballing, and I've defined that at the start of this questioning.
Let me put it in context. I think it's fair. These are important questions, and we shouldn't rush through them. If you look at the period 07 through 08, again, using the same charts that we all have, but without going through them, in almost 90% of the cases in that whole period...
With the greatest respect, you've made that point, that it was high... You've said this many times, and it's on the record, so we don't need to repeat it with respect. It was high relative to other banks, but the fact remains that the FSA said, notwithstanding the fact it was high relative to other banks, that it was still a breach of Principle 5. Now, you accept that, don't you?
Yes, and
Yes, okay. I want to make some progress on this, just so we're talking...
Can I say one quick comment?
Yes.
But I do agree with you.
Thank you.
The reports that came to me daily were the rate of LIBOR, not the relative ratings.
But why didn't you follow up with Mr. appropriately named Del Messier? Del Messier got the wrong impression. No one is disputing that. Did you have any discussions with him afterwards? Because you copied this to him on the 30th of October, didn't you?
Yes.
Right. You had no discussions with him about what he'd taken away from that copied email, which was your conversation with Paul Tucker.
This was not the first time Jerry and I had had discussions with Paul.
After he saw on the 30th of October.
I was not aware that Jerry had a miscommunication or a misunderstanding.
No, what I'm saying is, didn't you discuss with him after you copied that email to him that Paul
Discuss
Tucker,
what?
The contents of the Paul Tucker note that you did?
As I said, that my main focus on that note was the issue with Whitehall. Discussing it with John.
What did you say?
There were many.
What did you say to Del Messier after you sent that email, which was your account of your discussion on the 29th of October with Paul Tucker? That's what I'm asking. What discussions did you have with Mr. Del Messier about it?
I have no separate recollection other than the note.
You don't recall?
What we would have talked about is...
No, what did you say after you copied him in on that email? Because, as the FSA made clear, he had a misunderstanding of what was required of him. You accept that, don't you?
Yes.
Yes. So what discussion did you have with him about your conversation with Tucker?
A discussion about the contents of the note. But I was unaware that Jerry had the impression that the conversation that I had with Paul, either by note or by conversation, was an instruction.
Right.
And I was not aware that he did instruct.
Could I just ask, are you, Mr. Diamond, to the best of your knowledge and belief, under investigation in your capacity as former chief executive of Barclays Bank PLC? Are you under any civil or criminal investigation by either the FSA, the SEC, the CFTC, or the United States Department of Justice?
Not that I know.
Not to the best of your knowledge and belief. Okay. Could I ask you, do you think a criminal prosecution of a banker, that is to say, a criminal prosecution resulting in a custodial sentence, do you think that would be a necessary deterrent for bankers who are either reckless and or committers of wrongdoing?
I think that's a decision for the regulators.
No, I'm asking your personal view. You've been through the mill in the last few days, and I'm sure some people have sympathy for you, Mr. Diamond. I'm asking, given that you were talking about the culture on the Today programme lecture, and you've had quite a lot to say, haven't you, about the role of banking in our society. I'm asking you, do you think the role of banking in our society should include a regime, a more punitive regime, such that wrongdoers, either acting recklessly or deliberately to mislead markets, do you think that should lead to custodial sentences for bankers? It's a straight yes or no. What do you think?
I think people who do things that they're not supposed to do should be dealt with harshly. I think they should go through due process. I think we have been through a process ourselves of dealing harshly with people. David, when I got the results of this investigation, and it was because of the interviews, as I said, I didn't see a lot of the detail. I was aware there was an investigation, and I was broadly aware that things were coming out. When I read the emails from those traders, I got physically ill. It's reprehensible behavior, and if you're asking me, should those actions be dealt with? Absolutely. And immediately, when it became clear during the investigation that there was specific actions, it was dealt with at the time. We didn't wait for the end of the investigation. There were times during the investigation where it was less clear and due process was important. There were times when it was helpful to the investigation for people to be placed on suspension as opposed to terminated. But I want to assure you, David, that behavior was reprehensible. It was wrong. I'm sorry. I'm disappointed. And I'm also angry. There is absolutely no excuse for the behavior that was exhibited in those activities, in the types of emails that were written. And I stand for a lot of people at Barclays that are really, really angry about this. And one of my biggest worries is that this was wrong. And I'm not happy about it. But we put all the resources we could to make sure that the people that we knew that behavior was there were dealt with both the regulators in terms of anything that we can do in that regard. But this doesn't represent the Barclays that I know and I love, and it doesn't represent the work of 140,000 people who are working day in and day out for their clients and customers. And we have to be very careful, knowing how bad this was, that Barclays also got on top of it. There was no limit to the funds that could be invested for this investigation. We had it report directly to the board, not to the management of the organization, and we're taking actions on it. It was wrong.
Final question, Chairman. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Osborne, has said of your demise, I think it's the right decision for the country. Do you agree?
I wasn't aware of that, and I think my decision was the right decision for Barclays. And
for the country, the Chancellor says. Is that something you agree with, Mr. Diamond?
David, I love Barclays, and I'm not going to speculate on anything else. I love Barclays, but I also will tell you, for almost 25 years, I've been a part of the financial services industry in the UK. I've developed great relationships with regulators at the Bank of England, at the FSA, and the Treasury. I've loved my time here, and this is a great place to work. So.
I'm glad you can say that on the 4th of July.
Yeah.
This misunderstanding over your file note led to wrongful underreporting, which David was just referring to, and it's a very unusual file note. Do you understand our scepticism that even though you talk to Del Messier every day, that you never succeeded in clearing this misunderstanding up?
If you have any skepticism in what I'm telling you, I would be very surprised at that, yes.
Okay. George Moody.
I'm just a wee bit worried about how you ran that firm and your judgment. And it starts with what you said to Mr. Follen about you and John Varley seem to have the great fear and idea that Alistair Darling was wandering about the country looking for major banks to nationalise. You genuinely,
I didn't think that.
Well, you did. You said, well, we had to worry about this because the government was nationalising banks. And did you really think that Alistair Darling was looking to nationalise Barclays?
I didn't feel that of the Chancellor at all.
Good. Well, that's what you said, though.
No, I wasn't referring to the Chancellor. If I did,
let me just ask you, just on the question, David, the same question really, but just wider. You said that the first you knew, but David asked you about phase 3, which was after the conversation on the 29th of October 2008, or when the regulator, or the American regulator, indicated they were going to do an examination. Is that the first time you heard of any of the activities in phase 2, which was the rig the rate for in the public service, or phase 1, which was rig the rate for the benefit of Barclays? Is that the first time you knew anything was going on in your bank of that nature?
I think what you're asking, in the trader's behaviour was reprehensible. It wasn't.
No,
being,
I'm just asking
it wasn't
when
being
you
done.
knew of it.
No, I need to.
When you knew of it.
When I knew of it was during the investigation, if that was your question. But I do want to correct one thing you said, George. You said that the traders were acting on behalf of Barclays. They were acting on behalf of themselves. It's unclear of whether or not it benefited Barclays, but I don't think they had any interest in benefiting Barclays. I think they were benefiting their own.
So, Mr. Diamond, if we take phase one, where they were actually cheating and cheating pensioners, pension funds, cheating the ordinary public, cheating investors, you didn't know anything about that, and yet the regulator can document a trader sitting with a submitter and shouting across the room, this is the rate we're going to declare. Does anybody have a problem with that? Now, I mean, it's one thing, I don't expect you to look at all the emails, but did you run such a firm that nobody in the firm would think that's something the boss should know? Because this is crucial. This is the integrity of the bank.
Again, George, this was reprehensible behavior. It was.
I know that. I know that, Mr. Diamond.
I know that, but I have to answer on behalf of Barclays.
Did nobody? What kind of firm were you running? You're now out of a job because of the attack on the integrity of the bank, and that was the behaviour. And there was nobody in your firm when that was happening openly with traders that came to you and said, Bob, you're going to have to watch this because we're going to be in deep trouble.
This first came to light during the investigation.
Yeah, okay, I hear that.
The positive side is the organization said, we have a problem.
No.
We have to fix it. At
Mr. Diamond, no, from your point of view, that doesn't wash.
Can I finish?
No, it doesn't wash, because the real worry you have then, and you should have, is how were you running that firm? That the staff didn't have the confidence or the interest or the intelligence to come and say to the boss, some people were getting up to actions that could destroy the bank.
None of this information until until the investigation came above the desk supervisor level.
Well, what about phase two? What about phase two? Senior management, this is the FSA report. Senior management, and this is in September 2007, were worried at high levels within Barclays. No, at high levels within Barclays, expressed concerns over negative publicity. Their concerns, in turn, resulted in instructions being given to less senior management. Now, who do we describe as the senior management in Barclays, who were concerned about the effect that you're posting a higher figure than your competitor banks, and the worry about a Labour government of such radical beliefs that they were looking to nationalise banks would pounce on you unless you got something done with? What senior management were those?
My understanding from the report, and the regulators made a decision.
No, we're sitting here on the 4th of July. The report's published, but you've now had 3 years to find out who the hell were these senior management. Would you mind telling us?
It was people in the group treasury.
Right, and they wouldn't think to tell you or Messier.
Well, at the time, I wasn't the chief executive, so it wouldn't necessarily.
No, it was in your field, though.
No, it was the group.
Yeah, it was
group
in
treasury.
your field. Yeah. Well, so why didn't they tell you?
I don't want to disagree with you on the bigger question, but at the time, I was responsible for the investment bank, the asset management business, and the wealth business, and was not in the group. I am the chief executive today. But your question is right, George. This was wrong behavior. As soon as it came to light, it was addressed in a significant way, and I think the regulators have said that this is an industry-wide problem. There's other examples of it, but we have helped get to the bottom.
Just let me put this to you, because this is what the ordinary person out there will think. They were doing this, and then if we move on to phase 3, you have a telephone conversation on October the 29th, 2008, and your deputy, Messier, misunderstands apparently what you said and goes off and instructs his people to get the rate down. Why didn't And you're telling us, this is the point, they didn't turn around and say, but Jerry, we've been doing it for 18 months.
I'm sorry?
We've been doing it for 18 months.
I didn't get where that came from. I'm sorry, George.
You got this telephone, well, I'll go through it. You got this telephone.
In October 2008,
no, you got
I was
this
not
telephone.
aware of the behavior going on in the 2007
No, you didn't get it. I'll go through it again. In October, the 29th of October, 2008, you had a conversation with Tucker that you spoke to Missy about. He misunderstood, and as a result, instructions were given, get the rate down. What I'm asking is, what kind of organisation you're running? If he did that, why didn't somebody turn around to him and then he tell you, Bob, we've been doing that for 18 months. You've been doing it all through 2007. You didn't have to have that conversation. They were doing it. That's what they were doing, an act that could destroy the bank, and they were doing it. And then when you had this conversation, what? No, we're doing it.
Well, the behavior was wrong. The impact on the actual rate.
We know the behaviour was wrong, but the management in your place was extremely worrying. Now, did you
keep in mind, George, that this was not changing LIBOR rates. This was trying to influence where they were in the
This was in the public interest.
Wrong.
Yeah. This was to save you being nationalised. When did John Varley discover all this? Because he was the chief executive. If he'd been in your seat now, he'd be sacked, wouldn't he? Or he'd have resigned. So what did he know? Because he was you throughout that period. When did he say to you, Bob, we have a problem here?
John and I were both witnesses, and so it was inappropriate during the investigation to discuss either of our investigations, but we were both of the mind that we had to put all of our resources behind the investigation, find out what happened, and eradicate it. And George, I think it was, I'm sorry to come back to it again, but I think it's a sign of the culture of Barclays that we were willing to be first, we're willing to be fast, we're willing to come out with this. That doesn't excuse the behavior.
That's no the point that tells the world about Barclays. That tells the world about Barclays that two chief executives have been running the firm and it's been doing fundamentally wrong things. And your senior management have known about it, and they've either been too frightened or too disinterested to actually tell the chief executive. And that is a very worrying thing to come out of the inquiry.
Any response you want to make to that?
I'm sorry?
Is there any response you want to make to that?
I think the culture has shown that we're willing to, when we have a problem, we get all over it. As soon as it was known, it was dealt with.
Okay.
And I think that's an important thing. There's a reason
one wonders
this
how
industry-wide problem is coming out first now.
One wonders how much more noise there has to be in the firm about it before it does, as you put it, come out. When you've got derivatives traders shouting out across the trading floor their positions in order to confirm that no one has a conflicting preference to make prior to making a request to the submitters, paragraph 54 of the FSA report. Doesn't that say something about the culture in Barclays?
The fact that the supervisors didn't raise it further is wrong, and I agree.
Okay. Andrew Les.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Diamond, you seem to be inhabiting a slightly parallel universe, because you talk about the culture of Barclays as if that's the thing that saved Barclays. In fact, that's the thing that is the problem. Surely you must realise how enraged people are at the criminality, as well as you talk about reprehensible behaviour, it's actually criminality. And certainly there's a lot of talk that you yourself have been so unapproachable, and that's part of the reason for this. We also know that the absolute motivation for those traders prior to the financial crisis was their own personal gain, presumably because their own personal reward was only linked to the profitability of their own book and not linked to the profitability of the bank. I mean, what would you say to that?
In terms of the facts, which is the question?
Okay. Do you live in a parallel universe to the rest of the UK?
Andrea, I'm just going to say it again. The behavior when it came up, it was between 2005 and 2007 primarily. There were a few instances after that. There have been none since the investigation started. Andrea, it's wrong. It's reprehensible. It makes me angry. It makes me disappointed.
Okay, well,
and it puts a stain, particularly coming out in this way, it puts a real stain on an organization. This
yes,
was
it does.
14 traders, Andrea. We have a couple of thousand traders.
Can we just go on to that? Because I do want to focus on the criminality, so not the issues of the financial crisis, but the actual criminal behaviour. The CFTC says that took place between mid-2005 and late 2007, and then sporadically afterwards, so certainly into 2009. And there are 173 separate recorded requests for rate fixing to be done, either up or down, plus 58 for Euribor, 26 for Yen Libor, and 11 requests coming from ex-Barclays traders who are now at other banks, asking the Barclays submitters to fix rates on their behalf. So when you say it was limited to a small group of traders, clearly there was a significant amount of collusion going on.
Well, they were not looking to fix rates. They were looking to impact the LIBOR.
No, but can you
submission.
answer that question?
But it's equally wrong. It's wrong.
So do you agree, though, that this isn't a tiny issue that's limited to a small group of rogue individuals? This is actually collusion on something of a grand scale, and time will tell how grand it was. I mean, what do you have to say about those individuals and the fact that they were incentivised, allowed to be incentivised, simply to worry about the profitability of their own book, to the extent that ex-Barclays traders, who presumably had some prior loyalties from the rate submitters, were actually able to persuade them to advantage them when they'd left the group? What does that say about the culture at Barclays?
The behavior was appalling.
But it's
behavior
not.
was absolutely appalling, and as soon as we knew it, it has been eradicated. And many of the traders, when we discovered this, some had already left, and some were removed immediately. So when it was clear that there was this behavior, it was dealt with immediately.
And how many have gone to prison?
I can't go back and change that,
How many
but I
have gone
can
to
deal
prison?
with it. And there will be, I understand, there will be follow-up criminal investigations on certain individuals.
And you would support that?
Well, it's not up to us, but we're certainly not going to stand in the way of it.
Okay, so let's go then to the process by which this sort of activity could have been passed up through the bank. Can you tell us, where did you sit during the period of 2005 onwards? Where was your desk? Did you have a desk on the dealing room floor in the fixed income department at any time during that period?
No.
So you've never sat there. So did you ever take part in the daily morning meeting on the dealing room?
No. I don't recall that. Certainly not since, if it was, probably in the late 1990s.
And were the morning minutes taken of the morning meeting?
I wasn't a part of the minutes of the morning meeting.
Okay, but would
I think
minutes
it was
have been
done
taken?
over the intercom, so I'm not sure there were minutes. There may have been.
But I think that's a very important point, because it would be very interesting to see whether the question of what we'd like LIBOR to look like today was ever discussed over the tannoy system, since it clearly doesn't seem to have been something anybody bothered to keep at all
Well, if it had
secret.
been, it would have come out in this investigation. This is a very, very thorough investigation.
So if there were minutes taken and such a issue as falsifying
I'm sure that
LIBOR
will be
had
looked
come
at in the
across.
context of the investigation.
Okay, well that would be interesting to track down. So whose job would it have been in the dealing room to look for criminal activity? Whose function was it to be looking for criminal activity, and how did they do that?
That would fall within the area of compliance.
And how would compliance go about seeking out evidence of criminal activity within the dealing room?
Well, I'm not sure they were looking just for criminal activity, but they were looking for people complying with all the rules and regulations that we follow. And there's many ways from technology, from meetings, from training of people, from reviews of people. So it's quite pervasive, quite robust.
So compliance would sit in the dealing room or not?
I'm sure some of the people do.
Okay, so they would have been in a position to have picked up on this type of activity going on?
They didn't. So
They
that's the only
absolutely
answer.
never did.
And we've been very clear. This did not get above the supervisor level until we uncovered it. Once we uncovered it, we eradicated it, and it was wrong. I have no other way to explain it. We did not get a report above the supervisor of the desk level at any level of senior management in the firm. The second we did, The investigation was all over it, and the behavior was stopped.
Okay. Would a desk supervisor know and appreciate that falsifying LIBOR is an offence? Would they have been aware of that at the time?
Of course.
They would certainly have been aware of that. So desk supervisors would themselves have been entirely complicit in this fraudulent activity?
I think there have been cases where desk supervisors were aware, and in other cases where they weren't. And in those cases where desk supervisors were aware, they have been dealt with if it was clear, and it's done and dealt with. In some cases, we've asked them to either be suspended or stay on during the investigation with their compensation suspended if we needed them for the investigation, or if it wasn't clear and we needed the full due process. In each and every one of those cases, that due process is going on as we speak, and it began the moment that the investigation was published and announced.
So
I don't want to
confirm?
leave any impression about how sorry I am, how angry we are, how disappointed we are. What I'm saying in the context of Barclays, which is an amazing institution that I love, there are people doing things for their communities, for their customers and clients, 140,000 of them. And we're all impacted by these 14 traders. And it's not okay. It's not okay. No one is saying this was okay.
No,
it was wrong.
but the point I'm trying to get to is one about the attitude within the bank that allowed those 14 traders to do what they did.
I think
there has been. Can we just go back to the point about the desk supervisors? You're saying every desk supervisor would have been clear that falsifying LIBOR was wrong. They would have known that.
I would think that would be true.
You would require that. The bank would require them to know that that was wrong.
I would think that would be
and what action would they be required to take as desk supervisors if they knew that something was going on that was wrong? What was the procedure at the time if I, as a desk supervisor, knew something was illegal?
You keep coming on the same issue. It was wrong. It wasn't reported up. It should have been reported to compliance.
No, but I'm trying to understand what's the procedure that they didn't follow, that they should have followed to raise that hire that didn't happen. What was the actual procedure? Can you point to it in the Barclays Compliance Manual?
I don't have the manual with me, but I'm sure it's both compliance and to their boss.
And so they would have been actually openly required to raise that to a higher level. And so it would be very helpful to know who they should have raised it to and which part of the Barclays organisation that would have then gone through to get to the board.
Sorry, Andrea, that's very simple. It's compliance.
Just through compliance.
Well,
so not
also
through the
to their
Treasury
boss,
Committee.
but I think in terms of a supervisor level, the responsibility to inform their boss, but also responsibility to inform compliance. But I think there's no dispute there.
Okay, so effectively you would confirm again that this was people not doing their job?
In cases where that happened, they were not doing their job and they're being dealt with. And I want to make for the committee to know this again. It has been difficult to have some of these facts out there because they're bad.
Of course, no, we understand that.
It impacts the reputation. It absolutely does, David. But I also want the committee to understand that there are aspects of this which are industry-wide, but this bad behavior I'm not blaming on anyone. I blame it on these individuals, and they're being dealt with.
Okay. What steps have you taken now in light of the clearly openly fraudulent behaviour to look at other possible areas within the bank that could also be subject to fraudulent behaviour?
Two things I would say. First of all, I was gratified when I got the final report, very gratified, that the fact that we didn't wait to get this report was recognized by the Department of Justice, who says that our systems,
no, I'm sorry, can you answer the question? Which other areas have you looked at?
Improved.
Mr. Diamond, which other areas within the bank have you looked at where there may have been fraud?
It's been many years since this happened, and you can imagine how many different audits.
For example, Mr. Diamond, are you concerned that possibly the gilt-edged market has been in some way fixed by Barclays traders? Have you examined whether there was any potential for them to rig market auctions or other rate fixings within financial services? Have you examined those areas?
That would be a regular part of our audit cycle, yes.
But as indeed would LIBOR fixing, wouldn't it? That would have been a regular part of your audit cycle. And yet you didn't spot this for years.
Yes.
So, but you didn't spot the LIBOR manipulation.
But it was the
years.
behavior. It was the behavior before the submission was put in.
What I'm asking you is, in light of the fact that your audit failed to notice for several years that there was fraud and corruption going on under your noses and very openly, have you now looked at other areas of the bank to see whether something like that has been going on there for years too?
Of course.
You have. So this could not happen again. There would not be any merit in an inquiry into whether other parts of Barclays have been fraudulently fixing.
Well, I think the way to do that is to start by going through our processes and our controls and our audit reports. And if someone wasn't happy with those and made suggestions that there's other places to look, of course we would do it. But that's part of the overall process. Andrea, one of the things looking back, and this is, by the way, not meant as an excuse. The behavior was abhorrent. So I'm not making an excuse, but I do think context is helpful. It's interesting in Barclays because David and you have focused so much on the culture. And I understand that because there was such bad behavior. The rate setters in Barclays have been many of them have been here for 25 and 30 years. This is a core part of the Barclays UK business that Jesse was asking about earlier. This wasn't something that was created recently. So many of these people have been in their jobs for quite a while. The second thing I would say, and it's important to have it in context, is it was not perceived by the industry to be high risk. And part of that was for so many years the spreads were all so tight before we saw this that it wasn't considered high risk.
But you're just damning the culture even further, because effectively what you're saying is that the level of complacency, this had been going on for years, this is people who've been there for years.
I didn't say it was going on for years. I said that
you're saying the people have been there for years.
Audits are often based on where we see the risk to be highest. And the risk in the area of rate setting exploded during the financial crisis.
I'm not talking about the financial crisis, though, am I? Specifically, I'm talking about the criminality in the heydays before the financial crisis. I want to be very clear about that. And the key point here isn't it, that individuals were remunerated just to look after number one, even to the point that even people who left and went to other banks could still persuade someone for the price of a bottle of Bollinger to help their book. This wasn't about the banks, this was about absolute corruption within individuals within Barclays, and it was helped by the attitude within the bank that people were allowed to be remunerated vast sums for the profitability of their own book, regardless of what that did to the bank.
I think you take the conclusions way too far, but I am not going to defend the behavior of that group of people. The behavior was wrong. Their compensation was not based on just their own book. But I'm not going to disagree with you, Andrew, that behavior was wrong. And it's been eradicated, it's been dealt with, but there's no excuse for the behavior.
Andy Love.
Taking the conversation that we've had so far, do you accept that there is something wrong with the culture of the banking industry in this country?
Andrew, that's an appropriate question given the financial crisis, given what I've had to deal with in a short time as chief executive, from PPI scandal to swap mis-selling with small companies to the LIBOR scandal. And I think that there are aspects of the culture of financial services which are changing post-financial crisis and appropriately changing and evolving. And I think to Andrea's point, not the bad behavior, that's wrong in any time, in any age, in any business. But the context of people being rewarded more broadly on firm results, for example, is something we do even more of now. So I think
sorry to interrupt you, but can all of the problems that you've just highlighted, plus the one we're here to discuss today, be answered by changes in regulation? Surely there's something much deeper that's a problem with our banking industry. Would you accept that?
Well, Andrew, there were problems with the banking industry that led to PPI as an example. And I think today, one of the difficult things for bank chief executives is to recognize that there were some problems like PPI that happened many years ago over a period of time. But today, we still have to fix it. And so the best we can do is to recognize where those problems were, be completely transparent with the regulators and internally, understand exactly what the impact was, and learn from those mistakes. And if customers or clients were impacted,
well,
make them right.
There is something more you could do.
But
you could join the calls for the merit of having an independent investigation into the banking industry in this country. Would you support that?
I think that my own opinion is that there is a lot of regulation right now, and it's heightened tremendously post the crisis. And I would worry that what we're trying to do is to balance safe and sound banking with jobs and economic growth and competitiveness in our trade around the world. And I do feel that the level of regulation is, the level of scrutiny is higher, the focus is higher. And if I go back, Andrew, to the period of the crisis, it was difficult that when regulation wasn't this strong, other institutions failed, and that's been a burden on the taxpayers and a burden on the industry.
Well, so you're talking about regulation. I
think we have a better regulatory environment today, and I would be in favor of allowing the changes from the tripartite to the Bank of England to take hold before we do something else and add to it.
But that's merely a regulatory change, superficial. I sympathise and support your call for regulatory change, but there is something much deeper at work here, and really that has to be ventilated. And what I'm asking you is, do you think there will be a positive result for the UK banking industry? Will it re-establish trust, confidence, make you more transparent? Would that be something of benefit to the banking industry?
I think in any of these things, it's a balance between whether, how it's done and who does it and what the results are and how intrusive it is, against is it impacting our ability to do business with our customers. So it's hard to give a simple answer, Andrew.
Well, let me ask you, when your former chairman, Mr. Gaius, resigned, he led a statement out which says, the unacceptable standards of behaviour within the bank have dealt a devastating blow to Barclays' reputation. Do you accept that?
That's what I said in my opening. I think the actions that were announced last week, even though this is part of something that's industry-wide, even though this is part of something that was many years ago, is a shock. And with Barclays being the only bank right now in the frame, it has even more pressure on Barclays and has had more impact on its brand and reputation. The single biggest reason, if I can say that I stood down is I have an obligation to 140,000 people who work extremely hard, who have a great client business. Every one of our businesses in Barclays has been improving market share
I understand.
Since the crisis.
I understand that.
I can't let this small group of people impact the tremendous work that the people at Barclays do with their communities and with their customers and clients.
We've heard that in the recent past. Let me ask you, in terms of the deferred bonus scheme for senior executives in Barclays Bank, anyone that does harm to Barclays' reputation may be asked to forego some of those deferred bonuses. Do you think that's appropriate in your circumstances, in that you agree that Barclays' reputation has been harmed?
I think that's certainly a question for the board.
There's been comment in press reports that the board are pressing you to give up future share awards. Is that accurate, and are you minded to look appropriately at their request?
Andrew, you may understand this when I say it, but I have not been an avid reader of the press over the last week or so.
Do you have any more questions?
Just one. Sorry, you
brief question, a brief reply.
You rather took my attention away. In relation to the final payoff as you leave Barclays, do you think that there has to be recognition in that final payoff of what went wrong in Barclays and what should be done to put it right in the future?
I think the 16 years of my time at Barclays were a time of immense pride. We have an episode here that we have to fix. And I think those are questions for the board. I have not asked them, nor has that been of interest to me in the last day or so since I resigned. My focus was on preparing for today.
Mark Gunning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Darmond, a bit earlier you spoke to Mr. Norman about your time at CSFB and prior to that at Morgan Stanley when you were on the fixed interest in the foreign exchange department. Did you spend time way back when in the 80s actually on a dealing desk with a P&L working amongst all the traders?
Yes.
So you're very familiar with that culture of what it's like to actually be a dealer and a trader?
I was a trader, yes.
You were a trader. When you were there, did you ever speculate, and I'm not for a moment suggesting you ever did this, but did you ever speculate with your colleagues how much life would be easier if it were possible to perhaps adjust the closing price of a gilt at the end of the day in order to make your P&L look a tiny bit better of an evening?
This may age me. I guess it doesn't. I wasn't pre-LIBOR. I was my trading days were mostly.
But it's not about
US
LIBOR. It's just
Asia.
about the sort of the culture of idly speculating amongst your colleagues of an easier way of putting in perhaps a better result at the end of the day. Obviously, I'm not suggesting you would have done
nothing
it.
like that. No.
You would never have done it, but you never even speculated about it.
Speculated about what would it be like if we cheated? No.
Yeah, you never speculated.
No, I didn't.
Not even over a glass of beer or something, and just shooting the breeze
Never.
with the guys.
It's an easy question.
Easy question. The reason I asked that is because obviously you then came in and you set up Barclays Capital and you did a very good job. It became a big organisation.
I'm sorry?
You set up
Very good
Barclays.
job? Yeah.
You did a good. You
Just
certainly
looking
did a
for,
job. It's
just looking for a little love.
a little love. Okay. During the course of that, though, you would be establishing reporting lines, compliance lines, audit trails, all of that kind of stuff. And what I'm trying to get to the bottom of is looking at the compliance risk that would have been involved in this. By the time you were setting up Barclays Capital and running it, you would have spent quite a lot of time within this industry. And you would have spent quite a lot of time with these, to be fair, hot-blooded individuals in their late 20s, early 30s who are running these trading desks. And what I'm trying to get a flavour of is what efforts you made to assess the compliance risk that was inherent in this type of organisation, and how you established a compliance audit trail and a compliance structure that would take into account the risk that you would have assessed having worked your way up through the ranks.
Compliance was taken very seriously. I had it report directly into my chief operating officer, who had all of those areas when I was chief executive of Barclays Capital, which is the time.
But as you were
you're
building
asking
it,
about.
bear in mind you were the architect.
Building it and growing it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it was very important, and I think part of the risk management function is to have both the technology and the culture in place so things like this can't happen. And while this didn't present a big financial risk, the behavior of these 14 traders, it was a real break to Andrea's question of our culture. It was horrible. I mean, Mark, I mean it. When I was finally given all of the documents on the weekend before this became public, because I was on the, as we had talked about. And it took me a while to get them all downloaded. And so I was getting frustrated with my technology and getting it downloaded because I got it over a weekend. And as I got it downloaded and started going through it, and I got to some of the emails, I got physically ill. I mean, the culture was absolutely opposite of anything that we want. And to your point, we have to, we've talked about the no jerk rule. We're serious in Barclays, not just Barclays Capital and Barclays, that when people don't behave, they have to leave.
To some extent,
we missed it here.
Yeah,
we made it. We missed it with 14 people, and it was wrong.
And in terms of the problems that you had at Barclays Capital with the individuals trying to fix the LIBOR rate prior to the crisis, of course, that was entirely. It has to be laid at your feet because you were in charge of it and you built that system. So you have to accept responsibility ultimately as chief executive. What I'm also interested in, though, is turning this sort of slightly different way. Is looking at the at how the rate setters work. Now, as I understand it, so of course the problem with your 14 traders is in the swaps department in New York. So they were kind of out there working for you. But the submitters, the LIBOR submitters, are working for Barclays Bank, so not Barclays Capital, as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, and they are based in the London money market desk in London, is that right?
Yeah, slightly wrong, but you have the concept right. There were dollar LIBOR traders, some of them were in New York.
Yeah.
The rate setters were in London.
So but this is the point, all the rate setters were working for Barclays Bank in London under the kind of the umbrella of the London money market desk, is that right?
They were on the London money market desk in Barclays Capital at the time.
Barclays Capital, okay. So the London money market desk is they're responsible for balancing or for ensuring the liquidity of the entire organisation. They're coming in, the sort of balances are coming in for the whole bank, and the money market traders are then going out and making sure that the balance sheet balances, basically, aren't they? So that's kind of what they're doing. It's a function.
Well, the Treasury would be doing that at Group. That's okay. Where you were going, which was right. So.
Okay, because
so the execution into the markets, when Group Treasury decides this is what we have to do to balance our books, and they say raise $1 billion or sell $1 billion, so they'll execute that through the money market.
Okay, so the Treasury would work out what the book position is. Right. They would then send an order down to the London
Firm-wide
money market desk.
Right.
The money market desk would then go out and they'd say we need to buy in $1 billion, yep. 3-month dollars, whatever. Okay, that's fine. You also, on that London money market desk, although that's an execution function, you also have a P&L book, although there was a profit and loss trading book on that desk.
Separate, not with
but
is
there not a large conflict of interest that you've got on the one hand a group that are effectively executing the requirement of liquidity for the bank, and then you also have traders with a P&L book in that department as well?
They were separated. So there was no overlap between those. I agree with your point.
But were they in the same room?
Were they on the same floor? Yes.
So these guys could have been talking. I mean, it's rather like we can be talking across this table. They could have shouted across to them.
Not quite that, but
it's not unreasonable.
On one of a number of floors or large floors, yes, on the open, in the open.
Yeah. But I mean, as they went to the coffee machine, you could have, a guy with a book position could walk past a dealer taking a treasury instruction to go and fill a position.
Yes.
And therefore would be able to know what the order book of the bank would be, and then that book trader could potentially use that information to deal against the bank.
There was a protection of the information. Group Treasury had that information. All they would relay down.
Yeah, but as you've got a dealer sitting on the desk, I mean, you've got an order ticket sitting on your desk. In practical terms, the trader will write down the order. Sorry, the guy who's doing the dealing on behalf of Treasury would write down an order, say buy, kind of go out and buy, $500 million 3-month dollars at best, and the guy walking past him on the way to the coffee machine could see it, basically, potentially.
I'm not sure that was possible, Mark.
But you can see where I'm getting at. There's a potential compliance risk. This is
well, there's clearly in any trading operation a separation of governance.
No, sure, but there's not a separation.
But I don't mean to be holding you up in the question. Is there something I can?
Because what I'm going to next is of course within all of this floor, you've then got the LIBOR submitters, who are the ones who are actually sitting there, who are working out exactly what's going on. So they are looking at the requirement of the bank, actually what they're trading at, what they could trade at a certain size, all the kind of stuff that goes into setting a LIBOR rate. And they're within that mass of people doing all this trading.
Not really. They're on the floor, but they're in a separate area. But there's some separation. But people can walk by and.
I mean, it's a bit pally, isn't it? I mean, when you're thinking about this, you've got some quite important things going on. You've got a market making. So you've got a trading desk running a proprietary position. You've got an execution desk operating on behalf of the Treasury Department of one of the biggest banks. What have you got? £1 trillion balance sheet, £1.5 trillion.
But they're just executing in the market.
No one
would
know
the
appreciate
position
that,
behind
but this is information. It's all about.
Sorry, no, they wouldn't have the information of the positions of the group.
Assuming
I take your point, which is that we have to be careful.
Absolutely,
of the information flow.
And it creates an image of compliance slackness. Okay, because then, of course, the other point about this is we then come back to the LIBOR submitters, and this is something which I just haven't been able to reconcile in my head. I can understand a hot-headed idiot sitting in the New York swaps desk thinking it would be cool to send a bottle of champagne around to the bloke in London and say, can you fix LIBOR for me? But here's the reality. Why weren't those LIBOR setters turning around to these traders and say, guys, you can't do this. You're not allowed to do this. Stop sending me emails, otherwise I will tell my boss. Why weren't they doing that?
Some were and some weren't. And
well, who wasn't listening?
I'm sorry?
Who wasn't listening? So you say some were saying this. Some were saying this to their bosses.
Oh,
As a
sorry.
LIBOR
I said
setter.
some were accepting, some weren't. Not every rate setter was
No,
involved
sure.
in it.
But the rate setters were seeing this information coming in, weren't they? They were seeing these emails coming in. They were being sent. They were coming in. They were reading them. You'd agree with that?
177 requests.
177 requests.
Whatever the number was.
There aren't examples of 177 reply emails saying, stop this, you're not allowed to do it. There weren't 177 examples of a LIBOR setter going to his line manager or to his compliance officer and saying, I think we've got a problem. Until 2007, when we then did start having that. So answer me this question. Why were the LIBOR setters not alerting the compliance department or bouncing back those requests for rate setting back to those traders in New York?
During that period where this was the traders, they weren't, and it's inexcusable.
Okay. Now in 2007, you then get evidence in the US submission. December 2007, senior LIBOR dealer then finally emailed his supervisor to say that it was too high. He was asked to move it down. He said, my worry is that both Barclays and the contributor bank panel, are being seen to be contributing patently false rates. We are therefore being dishonest by definition and are at risk of damaging our reputation in the market with concern of regulators. Can we discuss this, please? The supervisor directed these concerns, the senior compliance officer, member of senior managers. That was in 2007, so this has been going for 2 or 3 years prior to that. It was only then that we started seeing any evidence that these rate setters were actually turning around and saying, no, you can't do this and we need to do something about it. So what then happened after that? What was the process whereby would you have heard about this?
No, as I said, this came to light to me during the investigation. And I know looking back, and Mark, if I'm answering the wrong question, just tell me, but there was pressure from the group treasury in the 07-08 period during the financial crisis. And there was a recognition that what they were trying to do was not to impact LIBOR rates, but to get in the pack, if I can use that phrase.
But
and that was discussed with the FSA through compliance.
No.
And I think that's
we've gone over that point a great deal. I'm trying to get to the bottom of why the LIBOR setting system was so flawed. Now, I appreciate it wasn't under your jurisdiction at that time, because you were obviously running Barclays Capital, and this would have been part of, well, actually, no, it was part of you, wasn't it? The FSA final notice, paragraph 147, Barclays had no specific systems and controls relating to LIBOR or Euribor submissions processes until at the earliest, December 2009. You didn't put in place policies giving clear guidance about the importance of integrity. You didn't provide training for submitters about the submissions process. It goes on. But paragraph 148, Barclays did not believe the submission of LIBOR was an area of significant risk. And yet, this is so sort of fundamentally core, training your staff, and my colleague will be following on about that, so I won't stray too much into that. But getting this culture right is not just on the dealing desk; it's also on the sort of the middle office functions, which I suspect LIBOR setting is. And I don't understand why that wasn't the case. The LIBOR setters, I am imagining, are not hot-headed 25 to 35-year-olds who like drinking Bollinger at the weekend. These are probably sort of slightly boffin-like people. So what's gone wrong there? Why has that department got it so fundamentally wrong?
I'm trying to disagree with your characterization of people, but I know what you mean, because the rate setters were, in almost each case, had been with Barclays for 25 or 30 years. They were some of our most senior staff. And the issue of not risk is complex, if I can say it, because clearly there were risks that no one understood, but usually is there financial risk involved. And it wasn't seen as an area, since it's a setting of rates, that it could create a financial risk. But one of the lessons learned in this, Mark, to your point, is our systems and controls with no excuses weren't strong enough. We started right away to get that improved, and that's the area where I do feel good that the Department of Justice has been clear that we have a very strong set of systems and controls in that area now. We didn't wait till the end of the investigation, and it is improved.
I have one last question.
Yes, sir.
And this is actually giving you a chance to put your side of the story when it comes to the FSA.
Briefly.
In 2008, clearly, 2007, 2008, your compliance officers then did start a dialogue with the FSA. You may not necessarily have submitted all the information perhaps that they needed, but nonetheless, do you feel that you were let down by the FSA in terms of the feedback you were getting from them and the advice you were getting from them, given the fact that you were now, at this point, reporting what was going wrong?
Well, I'm not going to pick out just the FSA, but is there clear evidence throughout our testimony that with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the FSA, the Bank of England, and BBA, that there were multiple, many-month, many-year conversations initiated by people at Barclays, that there was an issue around these issues. And if I can say this, Mark, in the context of the financial crisis, there is an expose in the Wall Street Journal over a number of days about LIBOR and the fact that people may not be reporting right. There's a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that looked at LIBOR during the financial crisis and said that the rates that people borrow at averaged 36 basis points higher than the rates that they were posting, and that there are other indexes that are better indications.
We know all that. Were you left high and dry by the regulators?
We can't sit here and say no one knew there was an issue around LIBOR in the industry. We can't do it. This wasn't a surprise. Bloomberg carried the story. The Wall Street Journal carried the story. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York did a report. And on multiple occasions, Barclays visited with the various regulators to bring these issues to their attention. Obviously, there were some issues.
And they left you high and dry?
I think, I'm not going to blame this on anyone else. The behavior was our fault.
But they were asleep at the wheel, weren't they?
Chairman, it's very difficult to say yes to that question, but were we disappointed that with multiple agencies and multiple conversations?
They weren't wide awake, were they? They really weren't wide awake.
There was an issue out there, and it should have been dealt with more broadly.
Okay,
yes.
Teresa Pierce.
You said that these traders weren't acting on behalf of the bank, they were acting on behalf of themselves. So I take from that that they were receiving reward for their actions.
Well, Andrea asked a similar question, which is, was their reward based solely on the profitability of their book? Absolutely not. But also, I have to be, clear that that was one of the factors that went into it, and
they were acting on behalf of themselves.
It was self-serving. In other words,
but is that not part of the remuneration package and the appraisal process? Where has the bank fallen down?
Absolutely, it's part of it.
So the senior management of the bank has fallen down in not appraising people properly and actually rewarding them for poor conduct.
No, I wouldn't say that.
But they
I think
were
where
rewarded.
we fell down is in not recognizing that this behavior went on until we caught it during the investigation.
But surely these people were appraised every year.
As I said, I think the individual profitability was one of many factors that into their appraisal, whether it was for their ego or for their compensation, it's still bad behavior. So
appraisals are
Teresa,
evaluated.
I'm not disagreeing with where you're going at all.
Mr. Diamond, when appraisals are done and evaluations are made, profitability will be looked at. How are ethics looked at? Is that part of an appraisal?
Yes, behavior is an important part, and in some of this time we didn't realize there was bad behavior.
Okay.
And as soon as we realized that people were fired.
That's interesting, because that takes me to the annual report 2011. And reports aren't just financial, they are actually your public window to the world of the mindset of your organisation. And the Barclays PLC annual report 2011 is 283 pages. As you would imagine, it mentions the word risk 1,734 times, profit 301, bonus 44, integrity twice, corporate values once, and ethics not at all. Is that the way you want to present Barclays to the world?
I don't want to present it as a...
It's your annual report.
You did a word sort and went through for certain words. I'd like to have a little bit more study before I agreed with that. But if the question is, do I believe ethics and integrity and values are important? You bet. And they're a precondition for anything else. I don't care how smart you are or how hard you work. If you don't have values and integrity, it's a non-starter.
Okay,
And this is difficult to say in an environment where I'm also saying, although I wasn't aware of it at the time, there was bad behavior, and it was not bad behavior, it was reprehensible.
Okay. You said that earlier, it was wrong, reprehensible, and it made you physically sick. And you said that this is a small number of traders. What sort of professional development do these traders have? Because surely all bank staff have to undergo that continual professional development. What review was ever made of that?
What review is made of the training and development?
What review? You've got a group of people in the bank who behaved so badly they made you physically sick, and yet it seems to me these are people who've been there for 25 years. Some people.
No, sorry, these ones. That was the setters.
Oh right, okay. So you have people that you said it's a small group of people. These are people. Would they not be registered with the FSA as fit and proper?
I would think so, yes.
So do you not, as their employer, have some responsibility to make sure they are fit and proper? And would not that be part of your responsibility? Would be to make sure they've undergone proper personal development?
Yes.
So something has gone wrong here.
Yes.
It's my understanding that since November 2011, the FSA requires all fixed line and mobile phone communications to be recorded, but it was best practice before that. The conversations in October 2008 with the Bank of England, would they have been recorded?
Sorry, my conversation with Paul Tucker?
Yes.
Not to my knowledge.
It wouldn't have been recorded?
No.
Was that normal?
The call came to me in my office in New York, and I'm sure during the investigation people would have looked for that, and I haven't heard of a report.
Well, maybe sometimes they only have to be kept for a certain amount of time. Maybe it wasn't kept for that much longer. But do you regret that, given that one of your famous quotes is that from you is, for me, if I was you, the evidence of culture is how people behave when no one's watching. If there's no one taking calls, how are they behaving when no one's listening?
I still believe that, and we had some exceptions to it, and they've reproven the point. These 14 traders did not behave very well when no one was watching, and I agree with you.
Surely the culture of a bank comes from the top.
Yes.
So is that one of the reasons you've resigned?
Not this specific issue. I think what we did in this report, Teresa, and listen, it's always hard to explain oneself when I was responsible for Barclays Capital at the time. I'm responsible for Barclays as chief executive, I was going to say today, until yesterday. But that's different than personal culpability for these actions. And I don't feel personal culpability, but what I do feel is a strong sense of responsibility, very strong sense, that when we find mistakes, we recognize them, we're open about them, and some people, you know, that they're open in the organization, that we report them to the regulators, that we take action on the people. And I do think, if I can take a second, I know how angry this can make others because it made me angry that we had this behavior. But I also am very proud of Barclays that they didn't worry about how is this going to look. We worried about, let's find out exactly what happened.
It was a voluntary disclosure.
Yes, the voluntary investigation at the time. We went beyond by bringing in two of the world's most successful and large international law firms, by having it report independent of management to the board, to the chairman of the board.
How much did that forensic exercise that took place to make you able to make that voluntary disclosure, how much did that cost?
I'm sorry?
How much did it cost in fees?
The amount of money that we have spent on this investigation is about £100 million.
Could I ask you, Barclays, do you use a balanced scorecard approach?
Yes.
Does ethics appear in the balanced scorecard?
I'm not sure if that's the word that's used in every balanced scorecard.
What do you think it might be?
Integrity.
Just in the last 3 years, what was actually done in specific actions, not just broad statements, but specific actions to rectify what is actually a cultural rot that's led us here today?
As we looked at the area, take the traders, as we broke this into 3 categories. If you take the traders first and foremost, it's been a significant investment in the system and controls in this area, and it's been a very serious upgrade of compliance, which had disappointments. We have a new head of legal and compliance and a number of new people under them throughout the entire organization as a result of this. And it has been the actions on the individuals would be 3 of the very specifics that I would give. And each individual that was involved in this, as I said, if it was clear what the behavior was and we didn't have to wait for the final investigation, we acted. If it was unclear and we needed to give due process, we're acting now. And there were some cases where it was felt that the investigation is better served by suspending their compensation but keeping them working. And part of the investigation, those people are also being dealt with now.
Last question. In January 2011, you came to this committee and you said there was a period of remorse and apology for banks, and I think that period needs to be over. Do you think it is?
Can I tell you it was February, not January, and avoid the question?
Yeah. No, it was before my time. I'll take it that it was the early part of 2011.
I think it did not come across in a way that I meant it or in a way that was positive, and
would you like to restate what you did mean then now?
You know, it's interesting, Teresa. What I said then and what I wanted to say is banks have to be better citizens, and it's interesting that I was aware of this investigation. I wasn't aware of the results.
I'm aware that you were aware.
This is one of the reasons why citizenship was one of my 4 planks when I became chief executive. We have to evolve the culture. We have to evolve the culture of banking.
It took a long time, though. This has taken a long time.
We've done a lot of...
Mr. Diamond, given that you have grown up in banking, you know, you're a career banker. You've been through the trading floor. You've come up. You've got a meteoric rise, and yet, you know, you say that the behaviour of these people was so shocking it made you physically sick. There would be a lot of people listening to this who weren't shocked. They were disappointed and angry, but they weren't shocked, and yet you were so shocked, and yet you spent your life in banks. Surely the culture does not come as a surprise to you. There
is no area that I have been responsible for in my career in banking where I would allow this kind of behavior. It is wrong that it took us too long to find it, but remember, this behavior was primarily 2005 to 2007. It was pre the financial crisis, and I think it's wrong. I'm making no excuses. It was wrong, but the actions we took when we find out, I think all of them were appropriate, including recognizing that we would be out ahead of the pack. And helping the regulators, and we did not think the focus on this would be as intense in terms of potentially harming our brand and reputation. But one of the reasons, standing down as chief executive or not, that I thought it important to come here today is Barclays. Barclays is an amazing place. I'm so privileged.
I understand that, Mr. Diamond.
We got that. We really did.
Chairman, it's not indicative of these 14
Chairman,
people.
can I just say,
to get across.
Mr. Diamond, you've told us repeatedly that you love Barclays. But what it seems, you say that you don't know anything that was going on. It seems you've not even met Barclays, let alone love Barclays. It's just, you just keep saying, I didn't know, no, you know, I wasn't aware.
I'm saying more than that. I'm talking a lot about what we did about it and how we behaved. I think that's unfair.
Well, you say that it's not indicative of Barclays, not indicative of these 14 people, but you've also said that was just read out, for me the evidence of culture is how people behave when no one is watching. And nobody at all was watching the trading desk, were they? And not even the compliance officer who was meant to be sitting there.
And the behavior was bad.
Yeah, and so you'll forgive us for thinking that there's something more widely wrong with the culture than just 14.
Well, I think that's why I've gone
traders.
into, I've taken such pains to go into the things that we have done and to put it in context, but I don't think I've taken any moment or second to excuse the behavior.
Okay, Pat McFadden.
Mr. Diamond, in the past few years, Barclays has been fined by the FSA for serious failures in systems and controls related to transaction reporting. It's been fined $300 million by the US authorities for knowingly and willfully violating international sanctions in Cuba, Iran, Libya, Sudan and Burma. It's been fined for client money breaches. It's had to pay £60 million in redress for mis-selling risky investment products to older people. And all of that is before the issue that we're talking about today. What do these repeated breaches of the law and regulations say about the culture of Barclays?
I think in each of these cases, and many of them have used PPI, or the issue about the US fine, were from periods that were quite a while ago. And many of them were in areas I'm not as familiar with because I had not worked in those areas. But I think what I can say is in each and every one of those cases, we have been open with the authorities and worked to get the solution and get the changes in place.
The point I'm making is that
but many of them
the
like
LIBOR
this.
scandal, forgive me, the point I'm making
one of the
is that the
difficult
LIBOR
things,
scandal is not an isolated incident in terms of
we had
running into
PPI,
trouble with the
we've had a number of them, and it's a large organization, but there's no excuse for any of them, but many of these go back quite a period of time. And one of the frustrations of keeping our organization positive today is that so many of these issues feel like, because it's come out this week and the shock is there, it feels like this is current behavior as opposed to behavior that came from quite a while ago. And that doesn't excuse it. That's not meant as an excuse, and we still have to go through the process.
You've quite famously pressed for a one Barclays culture throughout the organisation. And you've said many, many times today that the quotes in the emails that you saw made you quotes in the emails you saw from the traders made you physically sick. And of course you knew nothing about their activities. But isn't it the case that your hard-charging, high-risk, sometimes high-reward investment bank culture helps to give rise to that kind of risk-taking and sits uneasily with what the public want from banks, which is more boring, perhaps, but activity around mortgages, lending to small businesses, and looking after people's savings?
You know how I'm going to answer this, but I think it's a fair question. And these issues happen in Barclays Capital around the traders. But in the period from 1997 that Jesse mentioned, when Barclays Capital was formed, to today, it has exited proprietary trading. It's focused on its clients. And it has a track record in the business of compliance, a consistency of earnings, of risk management. This was a horrible experience and bad facts. But if you look at the track record of Barclays Capital, their consistency of earnings and their management of risk, you know, in areas like foreign exchange, where Barclays was not considered one of the top 25 participants in that market in the world when Barclays Capital was formed, today is number 1 or number 2, and 97%, 98% of the business, something like that, is all electronic and straight through processing. So the investment in technology, the investment in customers. It's interesting that of the fines you mentioned, the sanctions with Iran was something that was done in the UK retail and corporate bank. The PPI, which was £1.3 billion so far, is in retail banking and credit cards. That doesn't excuse it, and it's in past periods. And the head of the retail bank today is as angry as you can think. But a lot of this was happening in what you would think of as the boring banking. And if we look at the history of the United Kingdom financial services industry through the crisis, Bank of Scotland failed, Halifax failed, Alliance and Leicester failed, Northern Rock failed. So it wasn't investment banking that was creating the issues. And I worry that people are willing to throw, to assume that it's risky behavior that causes these things, or bad culture.
But isn't
and it is bad culture that causes these things. And in a case like this, we had bad performance, and the people are gone. And we had to fix that. It can happen in the investment bank. It can happen in a retail bank as well. We need a strong culture. We need strong systems and controls. But this isn't about a business model.
You obviously haven't had them with the litany of these regulatory breaches, and isn't a big part of the reason why you've had to resign. You talked in your letter last week to us about changing the culture. But isn't the problem that you have come to symbolise a culture that itself needs changing?
I don't think so at all. As I said to you, I think, last week it recognized, in spite of this, the support that I had and we had as an executive team to fix this and move on. And I think if you look at the Barclays performance through the financial crisis and the things that we're doing in our businesses in Africa, the technology that's being developed in Barclaycard, the Ping It technology that's come to the UK right at the forefront. Okay. There's a lot of fantastic
You're investing a lot in
things.
technology. Can I take you back to the memo that was released yesterday?
I think that memo was part of the investigation, so I don't think it was just released yesterday.
Which has been hugely covered today. In the FSA report, at paragraph 1112, which talks about the period a year before the call with Paul Tucker, senior managers at Barclays instructed submitters to put in false information to the LIBOR rate setting process because of concern over media attention. So we're not talking here about the rogue traders, we're talking about the financial crisis period when you were concerned over media attention. That was a full year before the call with Paul Tucker. You accept that's accurate?
Yes.
Again, in paragraph 118, November 2007, there's a conference call where manager E said, and I won't give the full quote, said of the intended submission, it's going to cause a storm. And a lower rate was submitted. Again, that was a full year before the Paul Tucker call, wasn't it? November 2007.
Yeah,
11 months.
Yeah.
Paragraph 127 of the FSA report details an instruction by a manager to Barclays money market desk to give a lower estimate of funding costs to the FSA than the desk originally intended after FSA inquiries because, and I quote, the honest truth would be a can of worms. That was in March 2008, 7 months before the Paul Tucker call. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a pattern after the rogue trader period, if you want to call it period 1, 2005 to 2007. There's a pattern within the financial crisis where there was consistently dishonest, lower rate submissions to LIBOR detailed in paragraph after paragraph of the FSA report. Do you accept that?
Can I put some context on it afterwards or now?
But do you accept the facts that I've just read out?
Yes, and we presented in our documents to you in the period 2000 to 2008 during the financial crisis. There was pressure being put on LIBOR submissions from the group treasury area to get back on the path. And Pat, what I would want to point out to you is this. If you go back to the same fundamental issue, which is that Barclays had met with the regulators, the 4 different regulators and multiple times, that we were consistently toward the high end of submission, and in this case, $3-month dollar LIBOR.
That's not the question I'm asking. I really want to focus on.
Let me just finish this and I'll come back. I promise. I'll answer it directly. But what was happening is the behavior was wrong. It was inexcusable. but the actions were taking into the pack and get away from the notoriety and the questions of Barclays, why do you always have to be high, and the potential implications for that. We weren't trying to lower our rates, and in about 90% of the cases in that entire 12 or 13 month time frame, Barclays was knocked out and at the high end.
I must dispute that, because each of the
so the issue...
No, forgive me. Each of the paragraphs I read out, paragraph 112 of the FSA report, paragraph 118 of the FSA report, and paragraph 127 does detail instances where Barclays agreed against the rules to put in submissions that were lower than the actual cost of borrowing. So you were putting in submissions that were lower. And what I really want to get at is in the context of at least a year of the financial crisis, when you acknowledged there was a pattern of, for concern over media or concern over the image of the bank, putting in lower submissions. Why did you release this document about the phone call with Paul Tucker yesterday? Why was that released, given that you're acknowledging now you had been doing this for a year before the phone call?
I didn't release the document. It was a package that came from Barclays. And I think the document was a part of the FSA investigation and the Department of Justice and the CFTC, so I wasn't aware that it was new. But the package came from Barclays.
Why should anyone see...
I think this is the package, Chairman, that came yesterday?
Yes.
The point I'm making is, how significant is this phone call, given the pattern detailed in paragraph after paragraph of the FSA report, which says that you had been consistently lowballing your submissions in the year running up to the phone call?
Well, two answers to that. One, the behavior of the people that were influencing lower submissions is wrong, and we were clear on that from the beginning. To answer it another way, what was the importance to me of the call from Paul, not the note, but the call? The call from Paul was alerting me that there was concern in Whitehall about why Barclays rates were high, and it was important to me to get to John Barley, who my note was to, so that he could get in touch with Whitehall and make sure there wasn't a misunderstanding that Barclays was high, or were there other people posting rates that made us appear to be high, and that there wasn't a function of not being able to get funded. So the importance of the call to me was the heads up about the concerns in Whitehall, who felt that since we were the high LIBOR submission, it might mean something more than it meant, or something different than it meant.
Thank you.
John Mann.
Thank you, Chairman. Before I ask my questions, I just wondered, Mr. Down, if you could remind me of the three founding principles of the Quakers who set up Barclays. And I could help, and I could offer to tattoo them on your knuckles if you want, because they're honesty, integrity, and plain dealing. Now that's the ethos of this bank that you've spent 2 hours telling us is doing so well. In fact, so much so I wondered why you'd not received an extra bonus rather than the sack from what you've told us. You've told us that, as I understand what you're saying, it's right that there's a criminal investigation. Some people, therefore, may go to prison amongst the people that you employed. You've told us that other banks were doing the same thing. I understand from what you're saying that you're telling us that you never questioned or analysed the rates that were reported between 2005 and 2008, and that you never discussed at a senior level the possibility of misreporting, misrepresenting by your traders. Is that accurate?
First of all, I think in terms of honesty, integrity, and plain dealing, that is how I behaved in my entire career in the business. So I agree with that. And that doesn't mean that I knew or was aware of the bad behavior. And as soon as I was aware, I did what I could to make sure it wasn't there. So if there's an inference that Barclays is anything other...
In 2005 to 2008, you never questioned, you never analysed, and you never asked about any kind of misreporting by anyone in the bank. That's the case, isn't it?
No one was aware of any misreporting.
You never asked. Now, did you ever read anything externally of other people suggesting there might be some misreporting?
I think there was, as I said, reports that came out probably in 07 and 08, not 05 and 06, but of the different issue of were people submitting appropriate LIBOR, more similar to the issues that we faced during the financial crisis. I was not aware of any reports on trade. Manipulating the submissions.
But you weren't aware of anyone suggesting that, and nobody came to you, not even those people who'd refused to act criminally, but had been asked to do so. You said to Mr. Garnier, and that some did, some didn't. So even those who'd refused to act improperly didn't come and tell you, and that never got to you during that 3-year period.
Well, they didn't act improperly.
No, and they didn't tell you. I mean, it does appear strange to the outside world that when people are asked to act criminally and they choose to do so, by externals as well as internals, they don't report that to the senior management. That does look rather incredulous to the outside world, I put it to. And you said that, to quote you, your obligation to complete transparency, that seeing is believing. But you seem to have seen nothing, known nothing, heard nothing in that 3-year period. Can I ask you about the following academic reports? In 1973, the first report into potential misreporting was written by a US academic called Spence. In the period up to 2007, there were a series of reports, but precisely early in 2007, another group of US academics, led by someone called Ewerhart, produced a precise report into this scandal, alleging it was going on, not naming Barclays, but alleging it was going on in companies like yours. That was then repeated by Abrantes Metz, who has written extensively on it, by Michaud and by Upper. So we have a series of academics who are reporting this is going on. Eventually, it gets into the Wall Street Journal, and from that, the Fed reports something. You're in charge. You're not seeing this. You're not reading it. I don't understand what you're doing.
I think you've conflated two separate issues. The issue of the traders and their attempts to manipulate submissions was not part of the Wall Street Journal report or the Federal Reserve report. That was about our institution.
Yeah, I've read it, but I'm also, those academic reports that led to that were, and they were explicit. Now, you've not read them, but you're the man in charge. You're getting paid huge bonuses. So you're in charge. People are suggesting from the outside impropriety, and you're not even asking questions internally, and people who've been told to act criminally are not coming to you to say they've been acted criminally. You know, either you were complicit in what was going on, or you were grossly negligent, or you were grossly incompetent. That's the only conclusion.
Sorry, John, I agree, and I've agreed from the beginning that the behavior was wrong. It didn't get above the supervisory level for a period of time, and as soon as it did, we took action. It's hard to give another answer than that. We keep getting the same question asked.
Well, no, but it's not the same. It's the same question. The point
we dealt
is,
with the activity as soon as we knew.
The reason people out there are beginning to agree with me, you said last time you don't really like Barclays, do you? Well, I'm in the, I'm in the more favourable group to people out there at the moment. What they're thinking is, hang on a minute, you're in charge, you're paid bonuses, 20-odd million a year in pay and bonuses, you're the man in charge, the buck stops with you, you're telling everyone that you've got to be judged on how we behave when no one's watching, that we've got to have complete transparency, that you can't work with the company, if you can't work with trust and integrity, you can't be in your team. You're saying all of that. You're getting paid these huge bonuses, but you haven't seen any of it. You must have been grossly incompetent in your job during that period of time if you weren't complicit in this.
So, is there a question?
Well, a good question would be then to go on to what you said to this committee last time you were here. You said, I think if it's clear that if any banking institution got into trouble where you first look is at the chief executive, the chairman asked you, OK, but how would you lose out? You replied, I would assume I would lose out by both losing my job and losing any shares that I had in the company. Will you therefore be forfeiting the unvested shares that you have in the company, as that's what you told us you would do in this situation?
As I said earlier, that's a discussion with the board. I don't make the decision.
But you're a man who's in favour of consistency. That's what you told us you would do last time you came to the committee. You have the choice in this. You can take the moral high ground in this.
John, we have been through this a number of times. The investigation of this was market leading. We have a profound issue that is an industry-wide issue, not just a Barclays issue, in terms of LIBOR submissions. I would suggest that we wait and see, importantly, what the ramifications of the industry-wide investigation are.
Yeah, but the FSA has reported into you, and it says in its report there were no clear lines of responsibility for systems and controls. You're the man in charge. You're the man in charge. You're the man who carries the can. You're the man who's been paid these huge, phenomenal bonuses. But you're accepting all the good side, the bonuses. The people working for you are fiddling the system, potentially some of them going to prison, criminality. You're the man in charge. You tell us, modestly, that in such a situation you lose your job, which you have, and you lose your shares. That's a pretty small price for you to pay. Or have you another suggestion of how you can show some contrition to those Barclays staff across the country and the customers who are wondering and emailing me in vast numbers saying, what do I do with my money? Do I take it out of this rotten thieving bank? That's what they're asking me. So I'm asking you, what are you going to do to put the record straight with your personal behaviour? Because you personally are responsible either by being complicit or by being incompetent.
So as I said earlier, I accept responsibility, and I also accept responsibility for the actions that we've taken to correct the situation, not just at Barclays, but also the way in which we've engaged with 3 of the largest regulators. You know, John, and I know there wasn't a personal culpability around the traders, but of course there's a responsibility. And I take the full results of the organization as having been on my watch, absolutely.
Well, my final point is this. I mean, you asked earlier for a little love from my colleagues, so I'll offer you a little love, because frankly, what happens to the shares does nothing for the taxpayer, because it's not going back to the taxpayer. Does nothing for the customer. It goes into the bank and disappears somewhere. You know, your bonus each year is equivalent to the amount of money that our largest homelessness charity shelter has to survive on. That's how much bonus you were getting in every one of these 3 rotten years, and all the others alongside you. Why don't you make a proper gesture and put some serious money and persuade your colleagues to do likewise, so that you can show to the outside world that you do mean business by saying that you're apologising, and persuade your colleagues, those who've left and those still in there, to do likewise. Then you might get a little love.
I told you I feel I've done the responsible thing in how we've handled this since the day we understood. So I think the way that the Barclays management team the culture of the organization, whether it's in PPI or this, to recognize when we have a problem, dig deeply to understand the problem, learn our lessons in terms of how we behave going forward, and if any of our customers or clients suffered, that we make it good.
Your reputation as a bank's in tatters worldwide. Someone needs to do something about that.
John Thursday. Bob, if you were an English cricketer, I rather suspect your name would be Geoffrey Boycott. You've been occupying the crease for 2.5 hours, and I'm not sure we're a great deal further forward. Let me try to widen this to the culture and ethics of banking, rather more than just Barclays. I think the question a lot of people want to know is this problem over LIBOR the disease, or actually a symptom of a much deeper and wider malaise? So can I begin by just asking you a few questions which I hope you can answer yes or no. First of all, do you consider that traders manipulating LIBOR for their own gain to be unethical?
Yeah.
Do you think that managers instructing subordinates to put in false quotes to be unethical?
Yes.
Do you believe that most submitters at other banks during the crisis were engaged in that kind of behaviour?
I can't judge other banks, John.
Do you think that selling a complex swap, as was reported on the 25th of April, to a Turkish shop owner with very little English to be ethical?
I don't know the situation as well as you do, specific one, but we have looked into each and every instance where a customer claims there was mis-selling. And there are occasions when a product has been sold to someone that probably it shouldn't have been, but in the vast majority of cases, over 90% that have gone to the FOS on the issue of derivatives to small businesses, the decision has been in favor of Barclays. And so we do work hard, and I have to point to the people.
I understand that from your previous
answers. So I don't
answers,
know the specific transaction.
And you can find that on the front page of Telegraph Business on the 25th of April, next to another claim which was submitted by Graiseley Properties, who issued a writ against Barclays for LIBOR fixing with a £36 million claim, based on the fact that Barclays sold a 20-year swap against a 5-year loan. Would you consider that to be ethical?
I don't know enough about the transaction, but I'd be happy to look at it, John.
If you take all of these instances and put them together, it is possible to conclude that there is quite a considerable degree of activity that is at the least questionable and in some cases unethical. How does a bank with a culture that you have tried to put forward to us have these instances in that number happening within the business?
Well, you're picking some isolated cases, and there's millions and millions and millions of transactions a day. And I know in the last year and a half since I've been chief executive, have been to many of the larger cities in the United Kingdom, visiting with small businesses, visiting with medium-sized businesses, and the feedback and the service that they get from Barclays has been very, very strong. The amount of business that we're doing in business lending has increased more than any other bank in the United Kingdom in the last year and a half. So I feel very confident that our team gets it. Now, one of the frustrations with a day like today is you're bringing up something on sanctions, which was so long ago in an area of Barclays I wasn't aware of at the time, that to bring it up today is not as relevant. Even the current issue that we announced last week, most of this behavior was in 2005 to 2007. So
Can I just ask you something? Does your board get a list of legal actions against it?
Sure.
So you will have seen, sitting on the board, a list of the legal actions. So you will know that a writ was issued in April claiming 36 million for LIBOR fixing, and that writ exists. That would be something you would know as an executive sitting on the main board.
I would know the summary of the legal issues that go to the board, yes.
And so you would also know what the legal department was proposing to do about that.
I'm not. Yes.
Well, most boards I've sat on that get a list
summary,
of the legal
yeah.
suits have a note from the company secretary or the legal department saying what's actually going to happen. So, how many actions are there outstanding against Barclays for mis-selling of swaps? Or is that the only one?
John, I'm certainly not sure of the number, but if they're legal actions, there's not many. I think the number that went to the FAWs over the last year, I think it was 40-something. It might have been more than that. I can't recall.
And if a LIBOR...
That wouldn't have been in the legal report because those were handled through the FAWs.
Okay. And if there was, if a LIBOR rate goes down, the break cost on a swap goes up. So a guy borrows at the start 2 million, paying interest, he's got a swap, LIBOR tanks, he might end up having to pay another 2 million as the break cost on that swap. So that guy is now owing 4 million.
Well, the economic impact of the swap, in theory, would be the same as a fixed loan. And if you take out a fixed loan at a higher interest rate and the rates fall, you mean if LIBOR goes down because rates are falling?
And you would then, when your managers went to talk to him about his loan covenant, the value of his loan, and the covenant he's given on that, they would then add the outstanding loan plus the new break costs together, which would mean that person would be outside of their covenant.
I'm not sure of the point.
The point is that you would then negotiate a new margin. So all across Britain, there are small and medium businesses who over the last 5 years were advised to buy product which has tanked. The net result is you're able to negotiate.
What has tanked, John? I'm not sure I understand.
What I'm
interest
saying
rates
is
have
that
dropped.
there is a huge cost relating LIBOR, which most of my constituents never heard of 10 days ago, to what is happening to their businesses. Is that the reason a lot of small businesses are finding it extraordinarily difficult is because of the swap that they were sold. LIBOR has gone down, causing the cost of the swap to go up, and that is a real cost to British business. And the key point is that none of them understood what they were purchasing, but they were obliged to take it because that was the terms and conditions for a loan from the bank, as it was for most banks.
And I think there are errors is the wrong word. I think there are parts of that I would look at very differently. So let me walk through it. Was there an impact on businesses in the UK in LIBOR? That the issues within Barclays, and we'll see with the other banks, were around dollar LIBOR, not sterling, in 3-month and 1 month, as opposed to the longer terms, which impact retail products and business products. So it wasn't in sterling. Even if it was, again, if we remember, it's the relative ranking that's being changed. So the impact on businesses that have taken out fixed loans or swaps. First of all, in theory, the economic impact of that is the same, of whether you take a loan and a swap or a fixed term loan versus a floating rate loan. And the impact on the business, when you say the LIBORs went down because the interest rates went down because, of course, the Bank of England has a low monetary policy interest rate because of the economy. So if anyone had taken out a fixed rate loan or a floating rate loan with a swap, they would be out not because of some issue on swaps, but on the issue of overall interest rates, which swaps follow. So I don't follow you. I do think that there has been an impact on business who have taken out fixed rate loans that today it would be more economic to take that loan today at a reduced rate.
The point here is, you and I have just had a conversation lasting 3 or 4 minutes that probably has defied understanding by most people. Our banks are run by people who talk that language. That's investment banking. Our high streets used to be run by people who didn't understand it, but just lent people money in a sensible way. And that is the cultural problem. Is it not?
I don't think so.
And actually, what we need is not one Barclays, but we need 2 cultures. If we're going to go on having universal banks, we need a culture that understands the high street and a culture that understands the city. And if we put them together, both will always lose.
And I think we have that, and I think it can be done. And I don't think this is about business models. So the people who cover our smaller businesses, Ian Stewart and his team, throughout throughout most of the areas in the north, is very focused on what are the needs of the small businesses, and if there is a need to provide a fixed term loan where it wouldn't potentially be appropriate from a credit point of view, or you can't get that loan and a derivative is a good replacement. The job of these bankers is to take them through the understanding of it. These aren't derivative people necessarily. Someone else will provide that product. I came back from Africa recently, as you and I have talked about before, and in areas like Ghana and Uganda. The country is very, very interested in Barclays bringing more of the sophistication of the investment bank alongside the retail bank, because the small and medium enterprise companies in Ghana, in Kenya, in Botswana, have to compete day in and day out much more with companies coming down from China, from India, and from the Middle East. And they need access to how can they hedge out commodity prices, how can they hedge out interest rates. So I think there is a place for an integrated model. And One Barclays, by the way, John, is not about our business model. One Barclays is about our culture, to the point that Andrea made earlier. And One Barclays, the definition that we talk about inside, is that One Barclays means that every single decision we make is in the best interest of the group, not the individual business, or as Teresa said, the individual trading position. And in order for us to truly believe that, everyone has to behave in that way. So it's about culture, it's about values, it's about integrity, it's about honesty, and to use John's words, it's about fair dealing. And that's what One Barclays is about. But I don't think the issues that we're facing are about business model. I think they're about bad behavior in some cases, and as you have said, culture.
We may have to continue to beg to disagree.
Okay. Stuart, happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Diamond, in your letter to us of the 28th of June, you spoke about your concerns about the integrity of the LIBOR setting process. You went on to say that various individuals within Barclays have raised these issues externally, including with the BBA, the FSA, the Bank of England, and the US Fed. Who at Barclays, at what level did your people raise the LIBOR setting concerns with these various agencies?
I don't know the exact level of every meeting. There is, I think in one of the letters, Chairman, is there not a discussion of who the people were on both sides, with the Fed, for example, and at Barclays? Do we not provide that information?
You may have. I'm just asking if you knew who, at the kind of level people were raising these concerns.
It was different. It was often in the Treasury, in the group Treasury area. In some cases, it came from the compliance area.
So you've got group Treasury and compliance people, presumably at a reasonably senior level, making approaches to regulators. Just in terms of that, in terms of the tripartite here, FSA is named and the Bank of England is named. Did any of your people discuss this with third leg with the Treasury in the UK?
I suspect the conversation came up in the general sense that we had talked about earlier about the Wall Street Journal report, the Bloomberg report, which is LIBOR representing the actual borrowing rates all the way through as opposed to any specific compliance issues.
Okay. How long had Barclays been concerned then about other people rigging the LIBOR rate before they raised these concerns with the regulators?
As I said earlier, I think this, I was going to say exploded, but that's the wrong word. This became a much bigger concern during the financial crisis in 07 and 08 because rates had been fairly steady. Liquidity was plentiful. And all of a sudden, with a financial crisis, we had much more volatility in rates, but we also had banks were having more difficulty lending to each other, which is the genesis of LIBOR, because of higher capital standards or because, in some banks' case, they had taken government money. The sum and essence of that was there was far less liquidity in the market, so more of the term borrowing of 3-month and 6-month and 1 year was coming from money funds, was coming from large corporates, was coming from asset management firms, and far less of it was interbank dealing because of the higher levels of capital required, the higher charges on interfund dealing. So there was a fundamental change driven by those two factors.
So the argument would fundamentally be because you knew no one was actually lending, some of the rates you were seeing stood out like a sore thumb.
I think it was not just that. I think there appeared to be postings that were being made at levels at which people would not have been able to borrow if they were looking to borrow.
Okay. And what was the response then from the BBA, from the FSA, from the Bank of England and others when you raised concerns that some of the LIBOR rates your competitors had simply didn't appear to be right?
Various levels of acknowledgement, but no action.
Okay. The thing I find odd, and forgive me if I'm a little blunt, that between January 2005 and July 2008, as the FSA have said, initially for trader greed, and then as a strategy for reputational risk management, Barclays were doing this. But you didn't appear to know what was happening internally till very late. And it does strike me as odd. Barclays people were able to notice other people doing this, submitting rates that were patently wrong, but no one internally was able to identify, even with people shouting across dealing room floors, that it was going on inside the bank. Do you understand why we find that quite difficult to believe?
Well, it's why I've been very, very clear today to not conflate the three issues. And I think there were three issues. There was the issue with the traders on the desk.
We've been through the three.
Okay. Well, I think Stuart, it was wrong. It was abhorrent.
I'm familiar with the various time frames and the various reasons and the fact you've apologised and said it's wrong. I'm asking why people at Barclays noticed other people doing this but were unable, for whatever reason, to recognise it was going on internally when people are shouting across a dealing room floor that they wanted a particular LIBOR rate to make some cash.
It's a different issue. It's a completely different issue. What Barclays was talking to the authorities about was the relative ranking of LIBOR rates. What was happening with the traders trying to influence their own firm was very different.
But it's not a different issue at all. They were submitting rates that were too low, just like Barclays were doing. Except Barclays noticed other people doing it, but couldn't notice themselves doing it. What was the flaw in management or the culture that allowed your people to see other banks, but not what was going on in front of their own nose?
I think the trader behavior we've been through time and time again, so I don't want to answer it again. The issue of trying to get back in the pack during the 2007 and 2008 period should have come up to senior management. I agree with you.
Right.
But it was an attempt to get in the pack not to impact to lower LIBOR rates.
Yeah, but it was an attempt to get in the pack so as not to be noticed, to manage the risk. And it was done in such a way that you were submitting, your people were submitting rates.
But Stuart, keep in mind that this behavior was discussed with the FSA. So there were discussions, as you know, in the discussion between compliance and the FSA about the fact that people were trying to get back in the pack rather than be the high, be the next high because of some of these issues. It doesn't excuse them.
And when you
say
discussed with the FSA, do you mean during the inquiry or while it was happening and prior to the investigation?
Prior, while it was happening.
That's tantamount to saying the FSA sanctioned the submission of overly low rates.
I think it's in the documentation, but I think what the FSA would say is that they had a different interpretation of the meeting, but certainly what came back to Barclays and to the chief operating officer of Barclays Capital was that it was all. Right, I think it's all documented in the report.
Just one final question. When Pat McFadden asked about the discussion with the phone call with Mr. Tucker, you said the concerns were that Whitehall was asking questions, and I think your answer, and I'm paraphrasing, was you'd have to get John Varley to be in touch with Whitehall. Did he speak to ministers or officials in the Treasury about that matter?
Yes, and I can't remember the exact conversation I had with John after that, but he did follow up. Right. And remember, we were right in that 2-day window before we had completed the equity transaction with the Qataris in Abu Dhabi, so it was a quite delicate time.
I'm sure it was, but it would be useful to know who he spoke to and what the nature of that conversation might be at some point, if that could be provided.
I'll see if we can provide that. I'll see if it's known.
Michael Fallon and Jesse Norman have quick rejoinders.
Just coming back to this note again, you've explained how you alerted John Varley that there might be some misunderstanding in Whitehall of your funding ability. I understand that from the note. What I'm not clear about is what is your understanding of what Mr. Tucker wanted you to do?
You know, I think that was the source of confusion within Barclays, if I can say it, in that this was not the first conversation I had had with Paul, or Jerry and I had had with Paul, or Jerry had had with Paul. Paul's job is to work with people at our level, and increasingly Jerry, as president of Barclays Capital and having the markets report up to him, was closer to the activity in the trading desks than I was. So sometimes Paul would go right to Jerry,
sure.
Sometimes to me. I'm sorry, I'm getting to the point, Michael.
What did you
understand?
And so the
issue
Mr.
with a
Tucker
broad discussion about Barclays is high relative to the others. You can see from our numbers going back during the financial crisis that we had many conversations about
I've seen all that. But what is it you thought Mr. Tucker wanted you to do?
He was pointing out the problem, and I was pointing out that the problem wasn't with Barclays, the problem was with other submissions. Sorry, that's
what did he want you to do?
Too shorthand to say it. As I said, I didn't take it as a directive. I took it as either a heads up that you're high or an annoyance that you're high. And what I said there was pretty clear. I'm not quoting exactly. I don't have the note in front of me, but I said the reality is that we at Barclays are reporting the rates at which we borrow. It certainly appears, given that a number of the institutions that are posting below us have had to take government money, that they aren't posting at those levels. So now this is the same issue, Michael, that the Wall Street Journal had reported on. This is the same issue that Bloomberg had reported on. This is the same issue that the Federal Reserve report after the crisis reported on. So I don't think anyone should be surprised that these conversations are happening.
Okay.
Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal reporting this. You didn't cross your mind to launch an investigation inside your own organisation just to check that this didn't mean you too?
Of course, we knew our policies, and I was under the impression and told that our policies were being adhered to. Yes.
Yeah. It didn't occur to you to think, well, I've just read this in the Wall Street Journal, but it's better check what we're not involved.
it's the right question, and as I said, I reconfirmed our policy. I don't know if
and
it
the
was
answer
the
is
Wall
it
Street
didn't,
Journal
the answer
article,
is it
but
didn't occur to you.
I reaffirmed it in that note.
Jesse Norman.
I mean, on that point, Mr. Diamond, I'm holding here a Bloomberg press release or article from May the 29th of 2008, which says, banks routinely misstated borrowing costs to the British Bankers Association to avoid the perception they faced difficulty raising funds as credit markets seized up, said Tim Bond, a strategist at Barclays Capital. So in May 2008, you have a strategist in your own organisation who is stating that these borrowing costs have been misstated. That's 5 months before your conversation with Paul Tucker. How could it be possible that you couldn't have been aware of it at that time and indeed actively under some internal obligation to launch an investigation?
Jesse, I'm going to say this again, and I think we need some context here. I'm not excusing any behavior. Park that for a second if we can just have a bigger discussion. And what I said is this isn't just Barclays. And you keep coming back to Barclays. And I have told you.
Well, that's the institution for which you were responsible.
Jesse, can I finish?
Sure.
Sure. If you go back to these reports, you will see throughout 2007 and 2008, no institution of the 16 banks reporting dollar LIBOR 3-month, which was the issue that people were talking about, was at the higher end more consistently than Barclays. And Barclays was getting questions about why is it always high, and we were saying we are high because we're reporting it where we're borrowing money. So for someone to say that there was a big concern, that there's virtually no periods where we're low or below and getting our numbers knocked out. So clearly there was an issue there. Now, along with that, there was pressure being put from the group treasurers we talked about to get back in the pack. Don't always be 16, maybe be 15, which is different than impacting the LIBOR rate necessarily. And I need to say again, Jesse, I'm not excusing that behavior. But I think it's also appropriate for the committee to step back and say that it was a financial crisis and that there are broader industry implications. And all I'm saying is look at the behavior of Barclays in the context of what we did about it once we found out. And I think the management team was decisive and unbending and fast and willing to invest and open. And the regulators applaud them for that. But also look at the fact that there are profound issues here about the operations of LIBOR during the financial crisis and the implications that may have. And I applaud the Chancellor, who's going to make the investigation more broad in the industry investigation about LIBOR. But I think those are the two conclusions. And I know, Jesse, there was bad behavior, and I can continue to apologize for it. I can't change it, but it was wrong.
Isn't the danger, though, that people won't see this in the context of the resolute action you say that was taken afterwards?
That's our job to do.
They will see it in the context of the swap scam, PPI, Proteum, this Brontos tax evasion transaction that was undertaken in Italy last year with UniCredit. That's the context. They're going to say this is a culture that was, deeply flawed, deeply corrupted, and that's where it went wrong.
I hope we look at this in the context of the decisive action that was taken as a sign of the culture and the willingness that when there's a problem, we're going to get to the bottom of it. And within the context that there's a broader industry issue. And lastly, I do hope, Jesse, that we look at this as having been a number of years ago, not today.
We've been going 2 3/4 hours, and 2 more colleagues want to chip in and finish. So I'll bring them in, but I really am going to finish this in less than 3 hours. Pat McFadden and then Mark Garnier.
Mr. Diamond, I just wanted to come back because your final answer to Stuart Posey implied that your back in the pack strategy had been shared with the FSA. Let me read out to you the relevant paragraph from their report on this. On March the 5th, 2008, the FSA contacted Barclays Money Market Desk to ask for information about Barclays' liquidity position. The FSA asked a submitter to provide information including the rates at which Barclays was currently paying for funding. The submitter intended to state that Barclays was paying for 1-year funding at LIBOR plus 20 basis points. The submitter discussed this in a telephone conversation with Manager D. Manager D stated, yeah, I wouldn't go there for the moment. I would rather we left that at like 0 or something. The submitter stated, it's a sad thing really, because if they're really trying to do something useful, it would be nice if they knew, but went on to acknowledge he had been worried about stating the honest truth because it might be a can of worms. Barclays informed the FSA it was paying for 1 year funding at LIBOR flat. So the truth is, Barclays didn't share the back in the pack strategy with the FSA. When the FSA asked you about it, you lied to them.
There were other meetings, and there's documentation of that. So,
did you accept that paragraph?
That's in the FSA findings. Of course, I do.
Mark Garnier.
Thank you. My question is very simple. I'm very suspicious of when people present me charts of certain things. We have distribution of LIBOR submissions for 2 month period, 3 months. Reading through the New York report from the New York authorities, they're talking about 1 month, they're talking about 12 months, and they're talking over a period of 2 or 3 years. Now, the reality, why have you chosen just these 2 months and 3 months? Is that because it's been presented in case better than anything else?
Not at all, Mark. What I thought was presented, and actually it was done yesterday by Barclays, but what's in my pack, which I thought was the same as your pack, was 2007 and 2008, because it touched on those second 2 periods, which was about relative rankings. So if you don't have those, I'm sure Barclays would be happy to send them to you. I've looked at all of them. You can also look at the 1 month, the 12 month. The story is similar. You can look at other currencies such as sterling and euro, and I'd be delighted to have your office get that. The story would be similar, and there was no attempt here other than the communications, whether it was from the discussion Paul and Jerry and I had, or Paul and I had, was 3 month dollar LIBOR, and many of the other issues were around 3 month dollar LIBOR. That's why we picked that, but we can show you the others.
It may be helpful.
We can show you sterling as well, if that helps.
Well, certainly Euribor, dollar LIBOR, sterling LIBOR for all the tenors over the period would be very helpful if that's easy for the committee.
Mr. Diamond, we've tried at any rate to lift the veil a little on the culture of Barclays in this inquiry over the last 3 hours. We've heard about unreported rigging of markets by a group of traders over many years. We've heard about market rigging in the other direction, underreporting during the financial crisis, which wasn't reported to the highest levels. And of course we've had the extraordinary situation where Mr. Del Messier didn't seem to communicate very well with you, and doesn't even seem surprised that he had, as he thought, got an authorization from you to fiddle the LIBOR returns. These are all of the sources of considerable concern to this committee and much more widely. Have you anything you want to add in response to that as we close?
Well, I've appreciated the opportunity to come here, and I think, Chairman, as you learned today, as soon as the behaviors that we have discussed in the report, the 3 regulators have discussed in these reports, were identified, they were acted on immediately. There was no expense spared. We brought in the right firms, and we've taken firm action. And I think when activities like this are found, with the culture I want to see at Barclays, is that when there are mistakes, that we admit them, that we learn from them, that we act on them, and that people have consequences. And this was, I think the second thing I would say in response to that is, it's difficult for Barclays, the firm that I care about so deeply and know the culture, to be isolated on this. And I worry that, I know Barclays, if we have another situation going forward, we'll still act the same way, to come out and be first, come out and be the first to correct it. But I worry that the impact of being first was because we were most cooperative, because we put the most resources into this, and the reaction to the one firm that's out first outside of the industry contact doesn't create great incentives for others to come forward. And so at the end of the day, I look forward to the continued investigation around the issues surrounding LIBOR. I think some of those issues are profound that came out during the credit crisis, and if there's anything that Barclays can do to help in that process, I know that they will.
I recognise we all do recognise it's not been an easy few days for you, and it's certainly not been an easy hearing for you. We're very grateful to you for coming this afternoon, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chairman.
Portcullis House, line 4, the Wilson Room. 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 Portcullis House, line 4, the Wilson Room.